Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku's Quirk Tore His Family Apart? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. This quirk remains a profound mystery around which young Izuku Midoriya's entire life has been built. It manifested so suddenly and violently that all memories of that day have almost vanished from his mind, leaving only unbearable pain. The endless agony, the overwhelming sense of despair, and his mother's eyes filled with primal fear and horror, these are the only remnants of that fateful night. Sometimes he sees it as a cruel joke played by his childish mind, a terrible reminder, or even punishment for his very existence. Despite his desperate attempts to suppress these memories, he almost flinches every time he meets his mother's gaze. Over time, he learned to hide his reaction, but each time their eyes meet, he searches in vain for the warmth and tenderness that has been replaced by an endless void consuming everything around her. This bottomless abyss whispers secrets of loss and despair directly into his broken heart. The chasm is so vast that he feels he could never fill it, tearing his soul apart with heart-wrenching despair, though he refuses to admit it even to himself. His father, as young Midoriya learned from his mother, left the same day his quirk manifested. While the memories of that day are filled with pain and terror, his recollections of his father before he turned 4 are tinged with warmth. Now, when Izuku tries to remember those early years, they blend together in a chaotic kaleidoscope where it's impossible to discern the sequence of events or their true context. Despite the passage of time blurring his past, he vividly remembers their family sitting together in the living room. He was drawing on papers scattered around him on the floor. His father shared everything he knew about heroes, while his mother sat beside them, drawing too. Izuku no longer recalls what she drew, but it no longer matters. When he thinks about those moments, he can still feel the warmth of the golden sunlight, the gentle summer breeze whispering through the slightly open balcony door. He remembers the admiration he felt when his father lifted him up and spun him around, making him feel like a real hero flying to save people. The laughter when Hisashi declared that his son's drawings were undoubtedly better than Inko's. His mother's face in those moments reflected multiple emotions: embarrassment causing a faint blush on her cheeks, happiness shining in her big smile, and love gleaming in her eyes. If you were to ask Izuku now, 10 years later, he wouldn't be able to explain what love truly is. He knows his mother loves him, and he loves her so deeply that he would do almost anything for her happiness. But those fleeting images of her face from his childhood remain distant and elusive, something he could never truly experience after that day. He thought about it often and endlessly, sometimes unable to sleep until dawn. This torment never left him, though its intensity varied. Repeating the same thoughts over and over in a futile attempt to find peace or a reasonable explanation never led to any conclusions. Deep down, he realized that his mother had never again looked at him with that inexplicable emotion called love, but he wasn't ready to accept that truth. It was a clear, warm night on a weekend. The air was heavy with moisture, but a cool mountain breeze swept through the city streets, making it possible to breathe deeply at last. This was a welcome relief after months of relentless rain during an unusually warm spring that had plagued most of Japan. The bright light of the full moon cast sharp, eerie shadows on the quiet streets. The soft chirping of birds and the distant hum of traffic in the neighboring areas created a soothing background noise like comforting white noise. Many residents were happy to open their windows and let this atmosphere fill their apartments, bringing a sense of calm and peace. A heart-wrenching child scream tore through the silence like a crack in fragile glass, shattering the Midoriya family's life into tiny pieces. When Inko finally woke up enough to realize something terrible was happening, her husband, who had been sleeping peacefully a moment ago, had already thrown off his blanket and rushed toward their son's room. Everything happened so quickly. It took only seconds for her to stand behind him at the door of their 4-year-old's bedroom, but to her, it felt like an eternity. Prolonged screams of pain filled with despair echoed from the nursery, interrupted only by loud, convulsive gasps before resuming with renewed intensity. Her mind raced, painting increasingly horrifying pictures of what could be causing her child such agony. With each new thought, her heartbeat grew stronger, each step became heavier, and tears quickly filled her eyes, blurring her vision. The moment Hisashi turned the doorknob, Inko froze. It felt as if her heart had stopped beating. The pain and fear swirling in her soul were like a raging whirlpool. Was it just the horror of what was happening, rapidly replacing the remnants of sleep and the calm that had been there that night? Or was there a thought so terrifying that it frightened her even more than the events unfolding right then? The thought that she wasn't ready to face what was behind that door, a heartbreaking realization that kept telling her to flee from what was about to happen. The answer would only come years later. For now, those thoughts were lost in an endless stream, rejected by every part of her being. Izuku! Hisashi's trembling voice rang out, raw and desperate. It sounded rough, with a wheeze from the painful lump in his throat. Like a hammer striking glass, leaving only dust behind. This finally brought his mother's attention back to reality, a reality far worse than anything her mind could have imagined. Izuku, her dear Izuku, with whom they had been drawing and laughing just hours before, was now lying on the floor, writhing in unnatural, agonizing spasms. His small hands dug into the carpet with incredible strength, and with each scream, he hit the floor in vain attempts to stop the spasms. The bright moonlight clearly showed his screams were interrupted by bloody coughing. Blood mixed with the endless flow of tears running down his face. His face, flushed with tension, reflected all the nightmares his parents could imagine. His eyes burned with fire, and his green eyes, once like endless emeralds, darted from side to side without focus, glinting in the red moonlight reflected in the pool of blood. His pajama was soaked with blood from the back, and blood dripped onto the shiny floor, spreading in a thin line where it hadn't been smudged by the child's hands, leaving palm prints everywhere. God! His father screamed, tears flowing freely. Collapsing to his knees, he scooped his son into his arms. Izuku didn't even notice the change. He continued to thrash and burst into tears. Hisashi, facing something worse than his darkest nightmares, turned to the only person who could help him, his wife. But instead, his wife's eyes were filled with emptiness as she stared at him and their son through a veil of tears streaming down her tightly clenched hands over her mouth. Something felt off, though he couldn't pinpoint what, just an unpleasant feeling in the back of his head saying something was wrong. But there was no time for that. He had once vowed to protect his family at all costs, and now he was the only one they could rely on. Ainko, he stuttered, speaking much softer than usual but still loud enough to be heard above the screams filling the room. Call an ambulance. I'll handle this. Though he tried to sound confident, he had no idea where to begin. These words were more of a futile attempt at consolation than a real promise. Inko, please, he repeated with undisguised despair when, after a few moments, there was still no response. He did his best to hold Izuku back, trying to prevent him from hurting himself further, but his wife's silence fueled his anger, growing rapidly until it threatened to overwhelm everything else. Inko! Hisashi shouted again, and a bright yellow light momentarily illuminated the room as flames burst from his mouth in a cry of despair. This finally snapped his wife back to reality and allowed her to see her son more clearly. That's... She began in a whisper. Those are wings. After finishing her sentence, she grabbed the doorframe with one hand and slowly sank to the ground, covering her face with the other to hide her tears, which had become even more intense. Completely confused, the man turned his gaze toward his son. The child's face grew increasingly pale, turning ghastly white, and his screams grew louder. But his father's attention was fixed on the two small, pink, blood-stained appendages growing from his son's back, slowly pushing through the collar of his pajama top. This allowed Hisashi to understand several terrible truths. Is this his quirk? He asked furiously, turning back to his wife. In response, there was only a slight nod of her head, still covered by her hand. He might not have noticed it if not for the flames that burst forth with his next breath. That answer was enough to shatter what remained of Hisashi's world completely. Even if the worst of his fears wasn't true, he knew the statistics all too well. Too many children didn't survive past 5 years because their quirks were too powerful for their small bodies to handle. This could have caused the father to dissociate completely from what was happening, if not for the sudden, oppressive silence that fell over them. It seemed as if even the birds outside the window had stopped singing. "Izuku!" Hisashi shouted in a long, drawn-out voice, interrupted by spasms in his throat. He pressed the now unconscious child's body to his chest and clutched his head with one hand. "No. Please. Hold on. Izuku, please." His sobs broke free, unrestrained now. He hugged his son as tightly as he could, his hands covered in blood. Only the sirens, now loud enough outside the window, could penetrate the unbearable horror and pain bubbling inside him. He rose abruptly, reached the door in 2 steps, pushed his wife aside, he didn't have time to deal with her now, and rushed to the exit. Covering Izuku's body with his own, he kicked the light door open with his shoulder and dashed down the stairs with all the strength he had left. If the minutes that passed seemed like an eternity to him, then the staircase seemed to stretch on forever. It was like a punishment in hell, forced to relive the same torment over and over again, with no escape. 3 long minutes passed before the doctors managed to restore Izuku's breathing. 20 minutes later, Inko sat on a small chair in the hospital waiting room while her husband dealt with the paperwork. Hisashi's explanation to the doctors was nothing more than desperate pleading. Neither he nor Inko, who followed close behind, could give a clear account of what had happened. The medical staff, however, acted swiftly, ignoring the parents' cries and springing into action as soon as the child was in the ambulance. Now that the patient's condition was stable, the hospital needed to gather more information. A meeting with the police might be necessary, but that was the last thing on Inko's mind right now. Inko was naturally shy and reserved, but her heart was as big as they come. That quality helped her connect with almost everyone she met and win people over. Unfortunately, it also made her vulnerable. Hisashi, on the other hand, was bold and unapologetic in his words and actions. Charismatic and good-looking, his quirk only enhanced his presence. He knew how to use it well, often settling disputes with classmates through small bursts of flame and sparks. He showed little interest in forming friendships or lasting connections with his peers. He openly expressed his disinterest in school. Later, Inko learned that Hisashi wasn't from Yuzurifu. His family moved there after he graduated from high school, and he longed to return to his hometown. The move was due to a lucrative job offer for his father. The area was booming back then, with new luxury complexes and office buildings springing up. The hero industry was thriving, especially after All Might made his mark on the scene. Yuzurifu became a major hub when All Might set up his agency there. New offices were built, aspiring heroes opened agencies, and luxury housing districts emerged. Hisashi's father, a construction worker with the ability to produce powerful streams of flame from his fingers, found this particularly useful. Hisashi and Inko met in high school. Their relationship wasn't a typical love-at-first-sight story. There were no sudden bursts of passion or romantic movie moments. Inko never sought such drama. Their relationship developed slowly. They bumped into each other at school, in stores, and parks. Initially, Inko would blush every time Hisashi smiled at her. Over time, she grew more comfortable around him. Their casual encounters turned into regular meetings. They'd sit together in the cafeteria and library, helping each other with schoolwork, Hisashi with math, Inko with biology. A special bond formed between them. Inko wondered why someone who seemed so distant and cold with others could be so kind and approachable with her. One spring day, as they strolled through the cherry blossoms, she finally asked him directly. He just smiled. Their friendship lasted for years. After graduation, Hisashi left, and Inko focused on her medical studies. Though their paths diverged, the memory of their friendship remained warm in her heart. 4 years later, they crossed paths again. Inko was working as a hospital nurse. That night, only 2 minor cases came through the emergency room, leaving the department quiet except for the hum of equipment. Inko was inventorying first aid supplies, humming a catchy tune. The peace was shattered by the wail of approaching sirens. Paramedics rushed in, pushing a gurney with a young man in bright orange firefighter gear and a black t-shirt, his face covered in soot. Firefighter with a head injury from falling debris, one paramedic reported. Possible smoke inhalation. Don't be ridiculous, the patient interrupted. I told you fire and smoke don't affect me. He coughed mid-sentence. The paramedic let out a weary sigh. He has a fiery quirk, he explained. No burns, but he was in the fire for quite a while. His throat might be fire-resistant, but not smoke-resistant. By then, they'd reached the hospital bed, and after the patient was transferred from the gurney, the paramedics departed with a nod to the doctor. The young man started to bow in gratitude, but the elderly doctor gently pushed him back onto the bed. Inko approached to assist with the examination and froze when their eyes met. Hisashi. Inko. They spoke in unison. Inko learned that her friend had returned to Mizudafu and was now a firefighter, a role that was increasingly in demand due to frequent hero-villain clashes. Despite the initial absurdity of a fire-breathing firefighter, Hisashi's quirk proved invaluable thanks to his fire immunity. They met several more times under similar circumstances, leading Inko to suspect he might be deliberately seeking accidents to see her. Their relationship deepened gradually. Inko began to suspect something more when she found herself thinking about Hisashi constantly, worrying about his safety. One anxious evening, she cooked enough food to feed an army salads, miso soup, pastries, and rice. Realizing this could be an excuse to visit him at the firehouse, she finally worked up the courage. From then on, their relationship evolved. They started visiting each other at work, not just during emergencies. Dinner dates became regular, and 2 years later, Hisashi took Inko on her first proper date to an upscale restaurant. She still blushed remembering how she'd cried that night. 2 more years passed before Inko found her fiancé surrounded by red camellias, a ring in hand. After tears and embraces, she said yes. Their wedding was inevitable. Time marched on, and romance gave way to routine, a natural evolution for most couples. They moved into a mortgage apartment, learned new things about each other, not all good, and faced their first arguments. Hisashi left firefighting for a higher-paying office job with longer hours. He left early and often returned after midnight. Their once warm home felt cold and gray, filled with chores and silent dinners. When Hisashi started staying out late and coming home drunk, they stopped eating together altogether. Divorce seemed imminent until Inko discovered she was PRGNT. The weeks around that revelation were a blur. She cried, feared telling Hisashi, but eventually shared the news. The PRGNCY brought new life to their relationship. Hisashi returned to his former self, brave, determined. Their feelings reignited, like spring after winter. Yet Inko feared the cycle would repeat. The young doctor, Watanabe Akira, who was on duty in the emergency room that night, was the first to meet the paramedics. He was also the one who later made all decisions regarding treatment and recovery. He was a short man with a thin build and blonde hair. His sharp facial features and attentive blue eyes under a slight squint created a very cautious first impression. Nevertheless, if you ask Watanabe's colleagues, they will all describe him as the most focused person they have ever known. His quirk, the microscope, prevented him from seeing clearly at distances exceeding a couple of meters. However, when an object was close, he could see all the smallest details, down to individual skin cells. This largely determined his desire to become a doctor in early childhood. Despite being quite cynical, the sight of the unconscious, barely breathing child covered in blood did not elicit the reaction one would expect. It seemed like just another patient for whom Akira had to do everything possible. But despite this, the image of his own 2-year-old son flashed before his eyes. Every new quirk awakening accident made the young doctor feel a growing sense of unease in his stomach and a slight tremor at the thought of his child going through something similar. Although professionalism demanded composure, his heart still ached at the sight of the suffering child. Akira mentally scolded himself for his weakness. Now was not the time for emotions. Having learned from his Hell internship experience, he instantly pushed aside his emotions and focused entirely on the small 4-year-old child. The boy had cute freckles and messy green hair, still covered in blood that had not yet dried. The skin and muscles on the child's back, torn during the wing release, regenerated quickly, which was not surprising. In most cases, quirks do not kill their users, as the body prepares for this over time. This preparation begins from the moment the egg first divides in the womb. Thankfully, this was the case here. The boy's back injuries would heal quickly without causing future complications. However, hypoxia posed a greater threat. Izuku had nearly bitten off his tongue. Blood clogged his nose and rapidly filled his mouth despite the hemostatic swabs placed by the paramedics. It flowed into his stomach and from the corners of his mouth. With each breath, blood entered his lungs, causing painful coughing. The oxygen supply to his body steadily decreased. Cynically, Watanabe felt relieved that the boy was unconscious. At least he wasn't experiencing intense pain right now. After a quick examination, it became clear that an urgent transfer to the operating room was needed. Akira handed the child over to his colleagues for transportation, ensuring the boy remained stable on his side. Before following, he needed to inform the parents of the preliminary findings. While preparing for the conversation, the doctor's gaze fell on the observation window. The parents were there, watching intently. The young father was covered in blood. It stained his clothes, hands, and face. Akira could see desperation in his moist, brown eyes despite the blur from his quirk. Sweat-soaked black hair stuck to the man's forehead, and his face was swollen and red. He stared at his son being taken away. The mother, a petite woman with long green hair and emerald eyes that stood out against her reddened eyelids, was different. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but her expression seemed distant. Her gaze wandered, unfocused. This might have been shock, but something in the doctor's mind doubted that simple explanation. But it doesn't matter. Now is not the time to think about it anyway. Dr. Watanabe left the exam room quickly, noticing from the corner of his eye how the father immediately moved toward him while the mother remained in place, staring at one point. Though this seemed like another warning sign, the doctor didn't pay attention to it. In the hallway, the worried father rushed to meet the doctor. But Akira, maintaining his professional calm, answered before the father could speak. "Your son is being taken to the operating room," he said in his soft, years-honed voice. "The injuries aren't as serious as they seem, but they require surgery. I'll go in as soon as the operating room is ready." The father's tension eased slightly. His shoulders relaxed, and the fear in his eyes was replaced by a slight glimmer of hope. The doctor observed this change and smiled sympathetically. "I'm Watanabe Akira, and I'll take care of your son," he continued softly. "The nurse will take you to the waiting room. There you can clean yourself up and collect your thoughts. I'll come there once the boy is safe." "Thank you," Hisashi said loudly, bending down 90 degrees with his hands pressed to his body. "I trust you. Please save Izuku." "Please, Don," Akira said softly, placing a gentle hand on the worried man's shoulder. "Stand up. I swear to you that I will do my best." Later, as sunlight filtered through the hospital lobby blinds and Izuku was safe with doctors, Hisashi tried to process what they'd been through. To his horror, he couldn't bear being near his wife. Anger, resentment, fear, and disappointment gnawed at him. Adrenaline and shock from the blood-soaked nursery scene haunted him. Sparks escaped his uncontrollable breathing. Hisashi left the waiting room and went to the hospital lobby as soon as he was able to clean himself up. He can't be in the same room with Inko right now. Was Izuku really his son? An idea he dismissed last night now felt real. Tears streamed down his face as he recalled. 4 years earlier, he'd studied quirk statistics obsessively. Mutational quirks usually appeared at birth, developing by age 4. Emitter quirks like his and Inko's typically emerged later, rarely before age 4. The Midoriya family, Hisashi's lineage, has always been marked by fire-based quirks passed down from father to son with alarming consistency. Regrettably, he's witnessed too many instances where a fiery quirk manifests without the corresponding fire immunity. His grandfather's family altar bears testamento this tragedy through numerous portraits of 4-year-olds, portraits that should never have existed. From the moment he learned of his wife's PR Jinsui, Hisashi dreaded the day Izuku's quirk would awaken. He studied every detail, mentally prepared himself, and believed he could somehow protect his child from disaster. Yesterday, when he heard those screams, he knew exactly what was happening. He'd anticipated this outcome, growing more anxious as Izuku's 4th birthday came and went. He rushed to the child's room, expecting to find flames to witness his son burning alive. But what he saw when the door opened defied all expectations. Now, reflecting on it, a rational explanation might be that Izuku inherited his mother's quirk and somehow injured himself. But the wings? Mutational quirks appearing after birth are exceedingly rare, and survival rates are even lower. He knew this for certain. He was also certain that parents without mutations couldn't produce a child with them, a well-established fact with only rare exceptions when a mutation skipped a generation. Hisashi slammed against the wall, teeth clenched tight, struggling to contain his power. Ironically, the pain helped ground him. He slid down the wall until he sat on the floor, head resting against the cool surface. Blinking away tears, he faced the truth. Izuku wasn't his son, and Inko's reaction confirmed it. If he believed in the stages of grief, he'd place himself between anger and denial. Memories flooded back like pieces of a twisted puzzle. Unwanted thoughts surfaced. Failed Senior CPTN, the forced happiness on Inko's face when they learned of the PR Suai. Was he reading too much into it, or was his mind finally seeing what was always there? The evidence was undeniable now. "Damn it," he whispered, squeezing his eyes shut against fresh tears. "You were so worried about hiding your affair that you didn't even care about your screaming child." A minute later, Inko emerged from the room, sunlight highlighting her tear-stained face. Her green eyes glistened in the light. Hisashi looked up without moving his head from the wall. "Dear," Inko began, her voice hoarse and quiet, prompting a scoff from Hisashi. "Hisashi," she tried again, closing the door behind her. "We need to talk." "Do we?" he asked, still not meeting her gaze. The rage he thought had subsided flared anew. "What do you want to discuss?" he demanded, rising to face her. "Your affair with that winged lover while I worked 18-hour shifts to support this family?" Inko recoiled. "That's not true. I would never cheat on you." "Don't play dumb," he snapped, gesturing toward Izuku's room. "You know it's all lies, yet you keep pretending." "You must listen," she pleaded, reaching for his hand, which he pulled away. "Don't touch me," he growled. "If you insist on acting foolish, we can do a paternity test right now. We're in a hospital." His voice rose with his anger, sparks dancing around him. Inko backed away, tears streaming down her face. "Don't cry now," he said sarcastically. "You brought this on yourself." The silence was broken by his sigh. "I'm sorry for yelling," he admitted hoarsely. "This is too much. No parent should endure this," Inko whispered through her tears. Trying to compose herself only made the lump in her throat worse. "Inko," Hisashi demanded his wife's attention, taking a deep breath. "Tell me honestly, is Izuku my child?" His voice trembled as he met her gaze, filled with raw sadness, despair, and pain. Sometimes, silence and an averted gaze speak louder than 1,000 words. "I can't do this, Inko," he whispered, covering his mouth with his hand as tears streamed down his cheeks. "That's it. I need a break." "Hisashi, wait." Inko began, but he cut her off. "Talk? Wait." His voice rose. "You've had plenty of time to talk, and I've waited long enough. The way you hid your PR Jin and CY from me. The way you've been sad every time Izuku and I play." He took a shaky breath, wiping away his tears, and continued without pause. "Did you think I didn't notice? A minute, I didn't see it until I started looking. I thought you had PSTPRTM depression when you cried every night for a month. I thought your nature made you so worried about him that you woke up from nightmares. But it was just guilt." His voice cracked, and the last of his breath left him with a burning sensation in his chest. He stared pleadingly into her red, tear-stained eyes, but only silence answered. Inko trembled, hugging herself, unable to meet his gaze. "I loved that child," he paused. "If only you'd told me from the start, we could." "It doesn't matter." The emphasis on the past tense of loved was unmistakable, and Inko couldn't ignore it. Her heart shattered completely, though it already felt in pieces. She'd prayed this day would never come, yet here they were. She could only watch, drowning in self-pity. "For Izuku's sake, we have to." She began, wiping her tears in a futile attempt to find courage, but he interrupted her again. Have to what? He asked with a sharp glance. Tell me honestly, Inko, are you ready to leave Izuku with me? I don't. She faltered, unable to find the words. That's your answer? Hisashi said with raw sadness. Forgive me. He took one final pained look at his wife, a bitter smile on his sorrowful face, and turned toward the exit. The pain of leaving Izuku, the regrets, the shame of giving up it all weighed on him. He fled, betrayed by the one person who mattered most at his darkest hour. But now, perhaps, it was time to face reality. Inko wanted to call out, to say something, but it was as if she were underwater, watching as the man she'd always loved walked away. She could only cling to faint hopes that he'd return. The hospital corridor was filled with the sound of his fading footsteps, the soft hum of medical equipment, and Inko's silent sobs. The morning light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows that seemed to mock the broken family. In that moment, everything that had once been solid and reliable crumbled into dust, leaving only pain, questions, and an uncertain future. At that time, in the operating room, when Akira had a chance to reflect on all of this quirk really presented many mysteries. Its late manifestation for a mutation type had no prior signs. It differed greatly from the quirks registered in his parents' files. No other manifestations appeared besides the wings. Watanabe couldn't find an explanation. Even the quirk specialist invited during the operation couldn't explain what had happened. There were only vague assumptions. The only comfort was that the boy's quirk didn't seem dangerous to him or others at the moment. Although this didn't answer any questions, it was something. After recovering, little Izuku would need a full quirk assessment, but for now, that was enough information. Despite the many unanswered questions, the surgical team worked professionally and efficiently. They quickly stopped the bleeding, stitched up the mouth wounds, and cleared the lungs. Then they carefully positioned the boy on his side without letting him lie on his stomach. Once they had cleaned away the blood during preparation, they could finally examine the young wings. They were quite small compared to the child's size and were attached between the shoulder blades. Despite his quirk allowing him to see minute details, Akira prayed not to notice anything alarming. Professionalism clashed with his paternal instincts. Images of his own 2-year-old son kept appearing in his mind. Fortunately, the wings and surrounding area appeared healthy and functional. The bright pink skin under the light white down looked normal. Given the rapid development of the wings, one might assume the young Midoriya's quirk was related to regeneration. However, this was contradicted by the necessity to apply stitches. Regardless, future tests would be needed to understand the full extent of the boy's abilities. For now, their primary goal had been achieved. His life was no longer in danger. By the time Watanabe reached the waiting room to inform the distraught parents, he found only the mother there. She was sitting in a chair, trying to make herself as small as possible. Inko had curled into a ball, shaking with sobs. She clung to her own shoulders as if trying to hold herself together. The doctor was stunned by the depth of her despair. She clearly wasn't herself, and the father was nowhere to be seen. The woman didn't seem to notice his arrival at all. Taking advantage of this, he quickly called for a psychologist before approaching her. He carefully knelt down so their eyes were level. "Mrs. Midoriya?" he asked gently. When she didn't respond, he continued, "Mrs. Midoriya, please look at me," adding as he gently touched her left arm, which was gripping her right shoulder so tightly it might break the skin. Inko's body tensed at his touch, but she didn't react. Her gaze remained distant, staring off into the distance. His heart began to beat faster. The absence of both Hisashi Midoriya and the psychologist made the doctor increasingly anxious. "Mrs. Midoriya," he tried again in a quiet, as gentle a voice as possible, "I need you to listen to me. Your son's condition is stable. The operation was successful." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Inko shifted her gaze to the man in front of her. Recognition flickered in the depths of her wet, green eyes, slightly squinted from prolonged crying and the bright sunlight, but it was faint, barely noticeable. "Can you hear me?" Akira asked carefully, trying to keep his voice calm and steady. Tears began to flow down her cheeks again, and her nervous sobs stopped. This was the only sign that she was present in the room and had truly processed what the doctor had told her. These tears seemed more like tears of relief. For a while, they sat in silence. Neither of them dared to speak first. The doctor waited for a reaction, trying to understand what thoughts were going through the woman's mind. Inko didn't know what to say, and even if she had tried, she didn't believe it would help. Just then, the psychologist arrived, breaking the heavy silence. Akira stepped aside to let the professional take over, but not before making a mental note to check on both parents later. Their reactions were too different. Unusual, and something again told him that there was more to this story than met the eye. As he left the waiting room, he had even more questions without answers in his mind. The nature of the boy's quirk, the parents' strange behavior, and the unexplained circumstances surrounding the incident, all of it formed a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. But as a doctor, he knew he had to. And since Izuku's condition was stable at the moment, that was all that mattered. The rest could wait until the boy fully recovered. The bright rays penetrated through the curtains, gradually warming the room. This created a strong contrast with the night coolness of the bedroom. The windless and warm atmosphere outside the window seemed like a great start to the day for Bakugo Masaru. Mitsuki, with her boundless energy, got up early and immediately rushed to the kitchen. After quickly drinking a cup of coffee as strong as a concrete wall, she immediately got down to what she called household chores. This day was no exception, and Masaru was not surprised at all by his wife's absence. Probably, she has already managed to turn the whole house upside down, he thought. Before going downstairs to greet her, he looked into his son's room. The boy was sleeping peacefully in a starfish position, drooling among the scattered pillows and blankets everywhere. Deciding not to disturb his son once more to avoid even more commotion, he carefully closed the door and walked on. In the kitchen, only a note greeted him. Went grocery shopping. Coffee is on the table. Love you. Masaru smiled, reading his wife's note, especially the little heart at the end. Since he had the chance to sit in silence, the elder Bakugo took the mentioned coffee from the counter, grabbed a tablet, and comfortably settled in a soft chair at the dining table. He turned on classical music and, slowly sipping the drink, began reading the news. When 15 minutes later the front door burst open and hit the wall so hard that the whole house seemed to shake, Masaru didn't even lift his gaze. He continued calmly sipping his coffee. After making a mental note to buy materials to repair the wall, he slowly put his cup aside and headed to the hallway to meet his wife. No matter how strange this dynamic might seem from the outside, it was quite a usual start to the morning for their family. The way the man always seemed calm and rational against the backdrop of his wife's explosive character often caused bewilderment at new acquaintances. But this, in fact, was the secret of their relationship. They quite complemented and balanced each other, although at first glance it might seem that it was Mitsuki who set the direction of their relationship. Even louder than usual, his wife's scream was heard even before the man could reach the hall. "Katsuki! Get your butt out of bed immediately, we're leaving." She threw grocery bags aside without even looking where, and with one sharp movement pulled open the dresser drawer to find the car keys. Droplets of sweat gleamed in the sun on her forehead. Coupled with a slight blush on her cheeks, it was obvious that she had practically run back from the grocery store. Apples and some oranges rolled across the floor toward Masaru's feet. His wife, having finally found the keys, slammed the drawer with the same disproportionate force. "Bakugo Katsuki, I swear that if I have to go upstairs for you, you will never see your hero comics again," she shouted with even more force. Given the open door, the elder Bakugo was sure that the whole block could hear it. And despite the fact that all the neighbors were already used to it, he made another mental note to apologize to them later. "Good morning, dear," he greeted his wife, calmly stepping over the fruits on the floor. "Oh, hello dear, I didn't even notice you," Mitsuki replied in a much calmer voice, with a slightly nervous but sincere smile. "I would love to hug you, but we have an emergency." "Will you tell me what kind of emergency it is?" Unflappable Masaru asked, already putting on his jacket and taking out his shoes from the shoe rack. "Katsuki, last warning," the woman shouted again before answering her husband. "It's Inko and Izuku, something has happened. I got a call from the hospital," she explained, looking much more tense and saddened than just moments ago. She wiped the sweat from her forehead and, as usual, rubbed it on her palms. "Are you sure it's worth taking the sun with us?" the man clarified, pulling the door out of the wall that was stuck in the plaster with the handle. "Maybe we should call someone to look after him?" "There's no time for that," she explained and took a breath to call their son again. Fortunately, he finally came into view, saving the peace of the neighbors who had not yet woken up. A mop of blonde hair was in complete chaos. His t-shirt was on backwards. The leg of his sports pants was pulled up, and the image was completed by multicolored socks on his feet. The boy, swaying, barely shuffled toward his parents, stepping over everything scattered on the floor. "What the hell are you screaming so early in the morning?" Not trying to restrain the volume of his voice, Katsuki became indignant, bending down to pull on his shoes. His mother's lips tightened into a thin line, and her eyebrows came together. "Where the hell did you pick up those words?" She was genuinely indignant. And without waiting for her son to pull on his shoes, she grabbed him by the waist with one sharp movement and, despite the resistance, walked quickly toward the car. Katsuki was shouting something indistinctly, apparently demanding to be released. Masaru took a deep breath and, running his hand through his chestnut hair in a futile attempt to smooth them, headed toward the exit. Along the way, he cast a glance at the fruits scattered on the floor, grocery bags, and other things that his wife had scattered in her haste. "It seems that this time it's really serious," he muttered to himself, leaving the house and locking the door. In fact, the elder Bakugo was used to the fact that everything concerning the Midoriya family had the highest priority for his wife. If, of course, one did not count her own family and their son. Especially their son. This sometimes caused a little jealousy in the husband, but he would never admit it even to himself. To say that Inko was her best friend would be a serious understatement. They became close like sisters practically from the moment the green-haired girl turned to the novice designer Mitsuki for help with her wedding dress. In fact, their friendship caused no less, if not more, bewilderment among those around them than the marriage to Bakugo Masaru. Compared to the man, Inko was a much more sensitive, compassionate, and shy person. It seemed that the constant bustle and shouting around would greatly confuse and frighten her. But, surprisingly, it was in the company of her newfound friend that she felt much more confident than one might think at first glance. The car was already parked at the entrance. Mitsuki was impatiently pressing the horn. Masaru quickly got into the passenger seat, and they set off in an unknown direction, leaving behind the calm morning that had so unexpectedly turned into a frantic chase after the unknown. Turning his head to the right, he noticed how his son, still dissatisfied, was staring at his mother with a piercing gaze, childishly puffing out his cheeks and crossing his arms over his chest. At such moments, when his red eyes were filled with discontent and his eyebrows were furrowed, he looked even more like Mitsuki. The boy didn't even pay attention to his incorrectly put-on t-shirt. This picture unwittingly made the father smile at the corner of his mouth despite the situation. "Maybe now you'll tell me what happened to Inko and Izuku?" Masaru asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Mitsuki, not taking her eyes off the road ahead, replied shortly, "Damn it, they didn't say anything specific." She paused to furiously honk at some elderly couple who, in her opinion, were driving too slowly and made a sharp maneuver to overtake them. The passengers were thrown first to the left, then to the right, forcing them to grab onto something. "And that guy Hisashi didn't even bother to pick up the phone," she said unperturbably, leveling the car in her lane. "Something happened to Zuku?" Katsuki's tense voice came from the back seat. His offended appearance changed to a strange expression reflecting something between anger and concern. He tried to unfasten his seatbelt to get closer to his parents in the front row and hear better what they were saying. "Now sit still and don't fidget," his mother interrupted him sharply, directing what seemed to be her most formidable and piercing gaze through the rearview mirror. Surprisingly, this worked on the child. The younger Bakugo stopped his attempt to neglect safety and, puffing out his cheeks even more, muttered something under his breath and, collapsing back into his seat, stared out the window. Masaru took a deep breath and cast a questioning glance at his wife, encouraging her to continue the story. "I have no idea," Mitsuki replied more calmly. "They told me they're in the hospital and Inko is not able to take care of her son, the woman finished, slightly revealing her anxiety at the end of the sentence. That sounds worrisome, Masaru could only state it. The next few minutes of the ride passed in complete silence, interrupted only by occasional sounds of sharp braking and honking, along with the woman's shouts at other road users. Katsuki continued to sit with a dissatisfied look and stare out the window. His father, in turn, was in deep thoughts. The composure they both displayed, not paying attention to such aggressive driving, spoke only of the fact that this was not the first time. Periodically grasping the door handle during another sharp maneuver, the little Bakugo, watching the cars, pedestrians, and facades of houses rushing by at high speed, became more and more lost in thought. For a 4-year-old child, he is still quite poor at expressing his emotions. And looking ahead, it can be said that little has changed in this regard over time. To be honest, he himself could hardly adequately assess his own emotions and their reasons in many cases. Of course, it's not like children were expected to have some exceptional abilities for introspection and reflection. Nevertheless, the very fact of not being able to understand in himself made Katsuki angry more and more. His thoughts were like porridge gradually boiling on the fire of his anger. What the f, do I have to get up so early in the morning because this little prick got into some kind of trouble? He muttered to himself. Pretending with feigned, and sometimes exaggerated bravado to hide his insecurity had become so natural to him that Bakugo began to believe that this was truly who he was. But why was his heart beating so fast and his palms sweating? Of course, he knew how people behave when they're worried. But this was definitely not his case, Katsuki thought. He wasn't as delicate a prick as Izuku or his other so-called friends from the preschool group. He rubbed his hands against his pants several times nervously and tried to get rid of the unpleasant clammy feeling by waving them in front of himself. Not noticing the sharp Swedish smell, the boy stared out the window again, not really paying attention to what was happening on the other side. In fact, Bakugo understood that his friend, whom he was used to calling the strange nickname Zuko, which appeared in response to what he considered a stupid kaken, didn't annoy him as much as the others. To be honest, he actually liked him to the point where he got upset when he heard his surname instead of the familiar nickname. Only Midoriya called him that. It had been going on for as long as he could remember. Katsuki was almost sure that this nickname was the result of his friend's stuttering and poor diction, but he stubbornly refused to admit it. Before Katsuki could move on to the next thought, which probably could have brought him closer to acknowledging their friendly relationship with the green-haired boy, the car came to a sudden screeching halt, causing him to fly forward, hitting his chest against the seatbelt. The screeching sound was replaced by the noise of a metallic impact. "In you," his mother shouted, hitting the horn several times with her fist. "What kind of JRK taught you to drive?" she directed a stream of abuse through the open window. Masaru took a deep breath and turned to his son, quickly checking his condition. He was sitting in his seat with an extremely frowning expression, trying to see something ahead. "Katsuki, are you okay?" his mother asked in a more calm tone when the stream of abuse had stopped. In response, there was only a sharp affirmative nod of the head and his favorite, he. Rolling her eyes, Mitsuki turned her glance to her husband. He indicated with a palm gesture that he was also fine. "Dear, we're all fine," he added, noticing how her hands were trembling. She was scared for them much more than could be suggested from the outside. "Let's focus on why we're here," he added, smiling gently and lightly covering Mitsuki's hand on the steering wheel. The impact wasn't severe, but it was sharp. The van had come out from behind a parked car, hitting their left side. The headlight and bumper were probably damaged, but that didn't matter. The main thing was that everyone was safe. With her family being okay, Mitsuki took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. She knew that now wasn't the time for emotions. Inko and Izuku needed them. Opening the door and quickly, ignoring the bewildered face and words of the van driver, she headed straight to the hospital entrance. Watching his wife leave, Masaru, also ignoring the bewildered look of the second participant in the incident, turned to his son in the back seat. Katsuki fidgeted, trying to see what was happening ahead. His face showed much more than he himself realized. Irritation had given way to anxiety. The parents were behaving quite nervously, and it seemed that the matter was indeed serious. The father, maintaining his usual calm demeanor, smiled slightly, trying to ease the tension. "Well, it looks like we're here for a while," he stated. "Maybe we should get some ice cream while Mom is busy with things?" Katsuki turned to look at his father and nodded shyly. It seemed that the attempt to bribe him had worked. Masaru smiled wider and got out of the car to finally talk to the confused van driver. Given the early morning and the day off, the incident was unlikely to be high on the police's list of priorities. Watanabe had certainly experienced many strange shifts during his, albeit short, career in the emergency department. Some were shocking, others were genuinely bewildering in their absurdity. But this particular shift was definitely winning in the categories of strange and frightening. He was sitting in his office. 4 cups of coffee consumed within 30 minutes were having their effect. Combined with the intense events and accumulated fatigue from the 24-hour shift, it was a wild cocktail that wouldn't let him calm down. He kept reviewing the medical records of young Izuku and his family on his laptop screen. His leg was tapping the floor, one hand flipping through the documents, while the other nervously clicked a pen in a futile attempt to relieve tension. Given that the head of the family had disappeared in an unknown direction and wasn't answering calls, and the mother was unable to finally explain what had happened, Akira had to try to assemble the puzzle on his own. This was critical for planning the next steps in treating his young patient. And being honest with himself, he also admitted that he was genuinely interested in figuring it out. At first glance, everything looked absolutely normal. Young parents, their first child. Multiple records of Inko Midoriya's visits to the GST ruled out the possibility that the boy had been adopted. Watanabe mentally crossed that point off. All known medical records of Izuku himself also couldn't bring the doctor any closer to solving the mystery. Everything from early LTR's NDS to examination protocols up to the age of 1.5 years was absolutely typical. Coming across an X-ray taken approximately 2 years ago, according to the date, he picked up the laptop and walked closer to the wall where the latest images were hanging on illuminated panels. Akira studied the images carefully, shifting his gaze from the monitor to the one on the wall and back. Perhaps due to fatigue or nervousness, he couldn't detect anything unusual at first. Sighing deeply, disappointed by yet another failure in his attempt to gain any information, he had already turned to go back to his desk. However, when he flipped the page, he saw the full conclusion that accompanied the image. Midoriya Izuku, 2 years old. First visit. Patient complaints, back pain when lying on the back, date of symptom onset, less than 2 weeks ago. The doctor stopped abruptly and turned his head to look at the image hanging on the wall behind him. This could be something, he thought, and turning his body, moved closer to the image. Before re-examining the image, he continued reading. General condition, satisfactory. Skin, clean, normal color. Local status, back palpation painless. Spinal asymmetry, none. Gait, not impaired. Spinal movements, preserved in full range. The doctor's eyes moved quickly as he read, and his eyebrows seemed to get closer together as more details emerged. Examination results. Clinical blood test, within normal limits. Biochemical blood test, no pathological changes. Chest X-ray, bone structure without pathological changes. Physiological curves preserved. Joint space is uniform. Akira scrolled back up to compare the description with the information he had just read. This time, despite understanding the futility of the attempt, he activated his quirk. Of course, all he saw were red, blue, and green dots. He knew it would be like that, but for some reason felt disappointed that it hadn't worked. Shaking his head and dismissing the foolish thoughts, he returned to his desk and continued reading. Primary diagnosis, not established. Comorbidities, none identified. Recommendations, consultation with a specialist with a relevant quirk for in-depth diagnostics. See the list of available doctors in the appendix to this conclusion. Remembering the date, the doctor scrolled further in hopes of finding conclusions from the specialist consultation, but, to his disappointment, the data was missing. The only remaining record was related to the flu a couple of months ago. He quickly scanned the conclusion. High fever, muscle pain, occasional seizures. Due to the absence of a specialist with a quirk capable of helping with infectious diseases in Mizudafu, A pain-relieving quirk was applied. Could this be a precursor to the boy's quirk manifestation? Watanabe pondered. It was just as likely as it was to be a mere coincidence. He sighed heavily again and, closing the laptop, cast a quick glance at the clock on his desk. In violation of protocol, 15 minutes earlier, he had unlocked Midoriya Inko's phone and called the contact labeled, "Dear Sister Craftswoman." The nickname of the contact, of course, was cute and made the doctor smile, but it did nothing to help suppress the feeling of shame for interfering in the patient's private life. However, the alternative options were to call the police to search for Midoriya Hisashi and involve child services to take care of the young boy while his mother recovered from shock. Considering that this story had too many gaps and everyone involved had been through a lot in the past few hours, there was no desire to complicate this family's life with unnecessary attention from child services. Either way, according to his estimates, the woman Midoriya had labeled as sister wouldn't arrive at the hospital for another 30 minutes. Akira wasn't sure whether to worry about that or be glad. His ears were still ringing from that conversation. In any case, he had some time to grab another coffee and stretch his legs a bit. As he passed by the reception area towards the cafeteria, it seemed he heard a familiar voice. Stopping, he tried to make out what was happening. All he could see were a beige spot with a white top and a blue spot with a dark top. All he could tell from that distance was that a nurse was arguing with someone who had blonde hair. However, as the argument escalated, he quickly recognized that expressive voice. Taking a deep breath and fixing his hair with one motion, Dr. Watanabe assumed his professional demeanor once again and headed straight for the reception area, which was about to turn into a battlefield. "I'm sorry, but you cannot enter the department unless you are a close relative of the patient," the male nurse at the desk repeated what seemed to be for the 10th time. His voice was calm, and his face showed no emotion. This only made Mitsuki angrier than the answer itself. She was about to open her mouth to object again, but the nurse interrupted her, "And no, we are not allowed to disclose patient information." "Fine. Then I'll find them myself." Unable to contain herself, she shouted and, quickly turning 90 degrees, walked briskly and confidently towards the emergency department. Before the nurse could shout that he would call security, the woman ran right into the doctor coming her way. With an unflappable demeanor, the doctor slightly bowed in apology. "I apologize," he spoke in a steady, quiet and calm voice. "I am Dr. Watanabe Akira. It seems we spoke about 20 minutes ago." Now standing so close, he could properly see the woman in front of him. She looked to be around 25 years old. Bright, red eyes, whose sharp shape was emphasized by thin, blonde eyebrows pinched at the bridge of her nose. The same blonde, slightly disheveled hair. Her light, impeccably smooth and slightly shiny skin deserved special attention. "Bakugo Mitsuki," she introduced herself, fixing her hair. "What is all this about?" "First you accidentally bump into you in the lobby." Watanabe interrupted her, using every muscle in his face to gesture towards the colleagues around them. "Please, let me buy you coffee as an apology." Mitsuki didn't immediately catch on. However, looking around, she realized everyone was staring at them. At that moment, when the doctor's strange behavior combined with what she'd heard from the nurse, a metaphorical switch clicked in her head. "Yes, of course." She loudly played along. "That's the least you could do." Dr. Watanabe smiled gently. "Please, let me escort you to the cafeteria," he said, gesturing politely in the right direction. Unnecessary attention from staff and other visitors seemed to finally leave the two of them. And as far as Akira could tell, no one even noticed that they turned left in the opposite direction from the cafeteria. "I apologize for this charade," he sighed lightly and excused himself. "I violated a dozen procedures by calling you. Therefore, I would like to avoid unnecessary attention," he explained. The professional mask left his face. There was no point in hiding his emotions now. He had just admitted to breaking rules in front of a stranger. And besides, he was exhausted, sleep-deprived, and wanted to sort out this mess as soon as possible. Mitsuki's expression softened. "Now that's what I call it." She commented, "You're a good doctor. Thank you for calling me." Through the hospital hallway, they reached a door with a sign that read, "Dr. Watanabe Akira, anesthesiologist-resuscitologist," in a beautiful golden frame. When the owner of the office opened the door and invited his guest to enter first, the woman found herself in a rather small room. To the left was a window overlooking the corridor. Despite this, sunlight filtered through the entire hallway and lowered blinds, casting thin threads of light across the doctor's desk. To the right on the counter stood a small coffee machine. There was a small armchair and another slightly smaller one right by the desk. On the other side stood a massive leather office chair. The glass desk itself was completely empty, save for a single laptop. Numerous diplomas and certificates adorned the light gray walls. The light parquet floor only enhanced the contrast between this small, cozy room filled with the smell of coffee and the bright, uniform hospital corridors filled with the smell of medicine. "Thank you, Miss Bakugo, for understanding the situation," Watanabe thanked her again. He gestured for the woman to take a seat and moved to his own chair. "It's Mrs., but that's okay," she corrected him and sat on the edge of the chair in front of the doctor's desk. "Let's get to the point." "Of course, Mrs. Bakugo." He corrected himself and opened his laptop to check his notes. He took a deep breath. His eyebrows tensed before he began speaking. "Before we start, may I ask how you are related to Inko Midoriya?" "I am her best friend," she replied with notes of pride and concern in her voice. "We've been through a lot together." "But what exactly is happening?" She pressed to get to the heart of the matter. Watanabe nodded thoughtfully, lightly tapping his fingers on the laptop keyboard. "That's exactly what I'm trying to figure out," he admitted. "Mrs. Midoriya is in a rather unstable mental state, and her husband is unreachable." He took a deep breath. "She's in severe shock, dehydrated. She lost consciousness from exhaustion and is now resting under medical supervision." "What?" she exclaimed, clenching her fists. "How can that be? Inko may be sensitive and gentle, but she's always been strong when it comes to Izuku." She took a deep breath and rubbed her temples. Mitsuki felt a wave of anxiety rising inside her, but she couldn't focus now and demanded answers. "Where is she now? I want to see her. And what about Izuku? Is he okay?" She asked question after question, not giving her interlocutor a chance to respond. However, Akira decided that letting the woman vent was the best option in this situation. Trying to interrupt her would only add fuel to the fire of her growing anxiety. And that coward Hisashi. "Where is he disappearing to at a time like this?" she muttered through clenched teeth, gripping the armrests of the chair. Between her heart, which wanted to rush out and find out for herself what was wrong with her friend, and her mind, which insisted on maintaining calm and getting more information, a desperate battle raged. Mitsuki might be quite expressive, but she could control herself. Therefore, the outcome of this battle was obvious. But she made a mental note to give Hisashi a piece of her mind when they met. The doctor began speaking as soon as the woman in front of him had calmed down enough. "She's in a ward now, resting. You can see her later. Izuku is fine for now, but he requires special care." He answered all the questions briefly and quickly. "Hisashi Midoriya was here, but left the hospital before the operation was over. We don't know where he is." Mitsuki stood up abruptly from the chair, her face contorted with anger. "What do you mean left the hospital before the operation was over?" Her voice rose almost to a shout. "He abandoned his wife and son at a time like this. This is just—" She wiped her face to calm down. "Where is Izuku now? Is someone staying with him?" she asked, now more calmly but with obvious tension in her voice. The doctor carefully observed her reaction. "The boy is under staff supervision," he assured her. "We're doing everything possible for his safety and comfort, but we need more information about his condition and medical history." He paused briefly and pointed vaguely at the laptop screen. "We really don't have much information." "I understand," Mitsuki replied to him. Her voice had become much more level and confident. She leaned both hands on the doctor's desk. "I know a lot about the Midoriya family. I've known this boy since he was born and have always been around." Dr. Watanabe looked at Mitsuki carefully. From such close range, he felt that heavy gaze even more strongly. Clearing his throat, he continued, "I'm glad I contacted you." He nodded with a slight smile. "Could you please tell me if Izuku has ever had any unusual symptoms or reactions to anything?" Mitsuki paused for a moment. She returned to a standing position and crossed her arms. Her eyebrows furrowed slightly, and her gaze was directed toward the ceiling. "He's always been a very sensitive child," she began. "Sometimes he had anxiety attacks, but I thought it was just part of growing up. And also—" She paused, as if hesitating whether to continue. "What else?" The doctor gently prompted her to continue, not taking his eyes off the laptop where he was making notes as they spoke. "Sometimes I thought he reacted too strongly to loud noises or bright lights," she admitted. "But Inko always said it was just a matter of character." "That could be important," Dr. Watanabe nodded, turning his gaze to the woman. "And what about his diet? Do you remember his height, weight?" Mitsuki resisted the urge to ask why they hadn't measured his height and weight themselves when he was right there. She took a calm breath, starting to rummage through her memory. Obviously, there were good reasons for these questions. The doctor wasn't teaching her about modern fashion, and she shouldn't be teaching him how to treat patients. "I can't say for sure," she said with some disappointment in her voice, "but my son is the same age and they're about the same height and build." She paused for a second, recalling the exact numbers: height about 102 centimeters, weight about 17 kilograms. Akira raised an eyebrow and looked at the monitor in front of him with surprise in his eyes. He leaned back in his chair and scratched his chin. "His current weight is 12.5 kilograms, he informed, speaking more to himself than to Mitsuki. "Mrs. Bakugo, have you noticed anything about his appetite recently?" he asked after a couple of seconds, directing his gaze at his interlocutor. This question seemed strange to the woman. The information she received only increased her anxiety. Focusing on the doctor, she sat back in the chair. "As far as I remember, Izuku could always eat a lot and often asked for seconds." She straightened her lips into a straight line. "Inko and I always cooked a lot for our children. I didn't think about it before, but little Izuku always seemed hungry." She looked away again, trying to remember something, "but I don't remember when it started." "About 2 years ago," Watanabe said. It was somewhere between a question and a statement. The new information was certainly helpful, but it also raised new questions. "You said your son is also 4 years old?" he clarified, and receiving an affirmative nod in response, continued, "Has his quirk manifested yet?" "No," Mitsuki answered briefly, shaking her head expressively from side to side, "but we're expecting it any day now." Well, if not the entire situation, then at least the sequence of events had been reconstructed. Akira went through the entire chain in his mind again. He quickly made a note in his laptop not to forget to request that X-ray image from 2 years ago. If his assumptions were correct, he would be able to find confirmation of it in that image. "And one last question for now," he said, looking at the clock. "Were there anyone in Izuku's family with bird quirks?" "Grandparents?" he asked. But seeing complete confusion in the woman's eyes, he continued, "Uncles, aunts, other distant relatives?" Mitsuki opened her mouth to say something but, unable to find the words, closed it. She was completely bewildered. However, after a couple of seconds of confusion, she was able to answer, "No." "Why are you asking?" The doctor's phone in his pocket made a beeping sound. "Excuse me," he said before taking the device out of his pocket. After glancing at the screen, his eyebrows furrowed, and the corner of his mouth tightened. "Izuku will be waking up soon," he informed and stood up from his chair. The woman stood up with him, anxiously rubbing her palms against her pants. "Thanks to your information, I was able to understand better." He thanked her and held out a white coat that he had previously taken from a hanger behind his back. "Please put this on. If anyone asks, you're my colleague whom I called for consultation." He hoped they hadn't encountered witnesses to their altercation at the registration desk. But this was the most reliable way to get Mrs. Bakugo into the ward. "Of course, Dr. Watanabe," she replied with a slight sly smile at the corners of her mouth. "Now She tried to read the name on the coat badge upside down. "Hayashi Sakura?" "Don't ask where I got this coat from," he said, leaving no room for objections. "I'm a grave," she replied to his interlocutor with a slight smile. She didn't really care whose coat it was. But this whole situation had at least slightly helped to lighten the atmosphere and relieve some of the burden that was currently hanging over them. While in the office, Mitsuki, despite the storm that raged inside her like an awakening volcano, felt protected. She felt that she could let her emotions out, at least slightly easing the pressure that seemed ready to completely take over her body and explode, leaving only small fragments behind. The cool air of the hospital corridor hit her face like an unexpected slap. The smell of antiseptic in the air made her want to empty her stomach, and the noise of conversations, footsteps of many people and plastic wheels rolling across the tiled floor caused a headache. Taking a breath as deep as her lungs would allow, she held it until she felt a burning sensation in her chest. Slowly, as if afraid of blowing away a butterfly from her hand, she exhaled and lightly patted her cheeks in an attempt to calm her anxiety and pull herself together. "Are you okay?" Dr. Watanabe asked, casting a concerned look at the woman while locking the door. Mitsuki swayed, clutching the wall. For a couple of seconds, she struggled with the panic that was coming over her before she could breathe again. "Yes, I'm fine," she finally said, forcing a fake smile. "It's just a lot." In reality, if anyone else had tried to describe all her feelings in such a way, Bakugo would have punched that JRK in the face right then. A lot was too far from describing everything that was happening around. Events were happening too quickly. There was too little information. The crumbs they had discussed with the doctor only raised more questions. It all seemed like a dream. A long, unpleasant dream that just wouldn't end. Each new fact that flashed before her eyes in an attempt to form a complete picture only made things more complicated. Multiple assumptions, each worse than the last, kept trying to break through the already thin, metaphorical wall that helped her keep herself together. Izuku's sudden weight loss, his father's disappearance, and the fact that the boy was in the hospital with his mother led to terrible conclusions. She rejected thoughts of violence in her friend's family even before she could fully comprehend it. Hisashi, although a JRK, could never raise a hand against his wife or child. That was a fact that was hard to deny. Even despite all the hostility that the elder Midoriya aroused in Bakugo. Her fingers involuntarily clenched into fists until her nails dug into her skin and her knuckles turned white. The pain helped her return to reality a bit, but could Mitsuki be sure that reality wouldn't be scarier than any, even the most insane, thought she had? She had experienced a lot of crap in her life, but now it was different. Now it was tutuch. Although the woman had always prided herself on her ability to hide her anxiety, at that moment, she was clearly failing, just as she had failed in being a good friend. "Mrs. Bakugo, please unclench your hands," the doctor asked softly in a whisper. "I'll tell you all the details on the way," he added, clearly noticing that his companion was immersed in her thoughts. Finally managing to compose herself, Mitsuki took another deep breath and spread her shoulders wide. She had read somewhere that this pose made you feel more confident. But right now, she was absolutely sure that it was complete crap. The thought of this was exactly the momentary distraction that was needed right now. She slowly unclenched her fists, feeling a tingling sensation in her fingertips. "I'm sorry," she said, focusing her gaze on the man in front of her. Dr. Watanabe nodded with a slight smile, tinged with sadness, as if understanding her state better than she did herself. Mitsuki couldn't tell whether it was his professional mask or real sympathy. "Really, too much," she repeated, still unable to find better words. "Let me start by saying that little Izuku's condition is caused by the awakening of his quirk," the doctor continued in an even, calm voice, as if he hadn't just helped a woman on the verge of a panic attack. "All his injuries are directly or indirectly related to this fact," he added, gesturing for her to follow him. "Don't tell me that his quirk," the friend of Inko tried to ask, remembering the strange question about relatives earlier, but was interrupted. "Yes," Akira replied confidently as if reading her thoughts. "It's a mutation quirk." He paused for a second when he accidentally brushed against a nurse who was rolling a cart down the hall in a hurry. Quickly apologizing with a fake smile on his face, he continued, "So, this quirk manifests itself with bird-like features in him, isn't it?" Mitsuki took advantage of the moment when the interlocutor was greeting a passing colleague. "Is that even possible?" I mean, it was difficult for her to gather her thoughts into a truly meaningful question while simultaneously processing the information she received. "The generally accepted opinion is that no, it's impossible," the doctor replied. By the way, do you know Hisashi Midoriya's blood type? He asked, suddenly stopping. The fair-haired woman almost ran into Dr. Watanabe. Fourth, I think. She answered as soon as she regained her footing, but I'm not sure. Akira sighed heavily and, closing his eyes, rubbed his temples with one hand, turning his face towards the floor. Izuku has the first blood type, he said, breaking into a plaintive groan at the end of the sentence. The doctor threw his head back and, after thinking for a few seconds, began moving down the hall just as abruptly as he had stopped, not waiting for his companion's reaction. Mitsuki, slightly puzzled by this reaction, nevertheless managed to quickly orient herself. What does this mean? She almost shouted, barely keeping up with the rapidly departing doctor. Her heart was pounding as if it were about to jump out of her chest. Before answering, the medical worker pressed the elevator call button, which they had just reached. Mrs. Midoriya has the third blood type, he said as soon as the humming sound signaled that the elevator had arrived and was heading to their floor. Sighing heavily again and rubbing his forehead with his palm, he continued, a child cannot inherit the first blood type if the parents have the third and fourth. Mitsuki felt like the ground was slipping away from under her feet. Cold sweat broke out on her forehead as she ran chaotic memories in her head. No, not Inko. That same Inko who had always been the epitome of loyalty and devotion. Could she really betray Hisashi? But then Hisashi, that selfish, self-centered type who had never appreciated what his wife had. Maybe she had reasons? But Inko isn't like that. She couldn't, or could she? Inko, her Inko, who had always put family first. The one who had sacrificed her dreams for the well-being of her husband and son. The one who had forgiven Hisashi all his antics. Could all of this have been a lie? Mitsuki felt doubts growing in her chest. Like thorny vines, they slowly twisted around her throat. She simply couldn't believe in her best friend's betrayal. The words, Inko, and betrayal were definitely the most real oxymoron. Mitsuki was torn between the desire to protect her friend and the impending need to accept an unpleasant truth. She had always prided herself on her honesty, but now, when that honesty could destroy her entire picture of the world. What if it's just a mistake? Her thoughts raced in an attempt to find an answer. At the same time, despite her complete rejection of the information received, the woman could not deny that this fact explained too many things at once to be a simple coincidence. Damn it, she quietly cursed to herself. This is the plot of a second-rate melodrama, she muttered, running her hand over the right side of her face with enough force to leave a red mark on her skin. Thousands of thoughts were spinning in her head. She literally saw her world crumbling like a sandcastle during a tsunami. The most disgusting thing was that even without confirmation, she was already thinking about how to help Inko if she had really done what she was suspected of. Does this really happen in life? Mitsuki asked quietly. Her red eyes widened. She glared at the doctor, as if trying to read the answer in his silence. Considering how absurd and insane stories sometimes happen in medical practice, the husband finds out about his wife's betrayal when their supposedly son is on the verge of death in the hospital. And unable to accept it, he runs away. Sounded not as crazy as it might seem at first glance. It was so close to the routine of hospital workers that a slight shiver ran down Akira's spine at the realization of this. Thus, the answer to the question he had previously asked remained only a sympathetic look and silence. At that moment, the elevator bell tore through the silence like a shot. Mitsuki flinched, and the stream of her reasoning was interrupted. She sighed, gathering her scattered thoughts together again, watching the elevator doors slowly part. The most logical thing to do right now would be to wait until she could talk to her friend and get answers. Maybe they couldn't conceive naturally and she used a donor? The red-eyed woman thought as she stepped into the elevator. This would explain everything. Mitsuki felt the tension leave her neck muscles. She had to talk to Inko. The boy's quirk manifested itself under extremely. He paused, thinking about how to present the information most delicately. Unfortunate circumstances, he finished the sentence. His movements were mechanical, almost robotic. Pressing the elevator button, he simultaneously monitored Mrs. Bakugo's condition. Assessing her reaction and seeing that her gaze urged him to continue without words, he continued hesitantly, We don't know exactly what happened. Oh my God. Mitsuki interrupted him loudly, taking advantage of the fact that there was no one else in the elevator. Just tell me straight. Akira sighed with some relief. Izuku lost a lot of blood, he said, deciding to omit the details. At some point he bit his tongue seriously. How serious? His companion interrupted. But seeing the obvious bewilderment at this particular question on the doctor's face, she quickly corrected herself. Forget what I said. Nurse. All right, Watanabe could understand that. He won't be able to speak at all or close to it in the near future. He finished his thought with the most important part. After a moment's reflection, he added, somewhat unexpectedly even for himself, in a soft voice with a barely audible stammer, Thank you for coming. He bowed to the woman in front of him. I can't imagine how broken the child would be if there was no one he knew nearby. Mitsuki's eyebrows twitched, and something vaguely resembling relief flashed in her eyes. I would have done it even if you hadn't asked, she replied firmly, neither accepting nor rejecting the gratitude. At that moment, the elevator came to a halt with a characteristic metallic clang that echoed off the walls. Without saying another word, the doctor once again gestured softly and politely, inviting his companion to proceed further. The atmosphere in the ward was vastly different from what the woman had experienced on the ground floor corridors. Here, it was eerily quiet, no footsteps, no conversations. Only the monotonous, muted hum of medical equipment gently filled the space. Sunlight filtered through the window at the far end of the corridor, reflecting off the cold tiled floor and shimmering highlights on the walls. Mitsuki couldn't help but shiver as she stepped into this space. The entire place seemed abandoned, forgotten by everyone, where every sound, every rustle felt alien. The air here was different, heavy, saturated with the smell of medicine, leaving a metallic taste on the tip of her tongue. Unexpectedly, the doctor's words from earlier in the elevator replayed in her. Imagining the scene of little Izuku, such a kind and positive boy with a smile that always shone like a ray of sunshine, waking up alone in such a place, her heart clenched like a vice. All traces of her former anger and confusion vanished. Tears, the first of the day, welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision, and Mitsuki could barely make out the outlines of the corridor. The doctor, seemingly sensing her state, slowed his pace slightly, giving her a few extra seconds before they had to enter the room. Approaching the massive door, next to which was a large window, Watanabe quietly cleared his throat, drawing her attention, and nodded towards the window. Only then did Mitsuki notice they had arrived. Her gaze darted through the window and the half-closed blinds to the bed where a frail figure of a boy could be seen under the snow-white sheets, lying on his side with his body slightly turned towards his stomach. Because of this unusual position, his face, turned towards the window, was clearly visible. Mitsuki froze, unable to tear her eyes away. His green locks were matted. His complexion was too pale, and all the once chubby cheeks seemed to have vanished, revealing sharp features. She involuntarily reached out, her fingertips touching the glass, as a lump formed in her throat. Dr. Watanabe was acutely aware that in such moments, the best course of action was to give visitors some time. The sight of a loved one in such a state could be deeply painful, and time was needed to come to terms with that pain. He wished he could offer comfort, assure them that the pain would pass. But he couldn't lie or give people false hope. The truth was that this pain could haunt them for the rest of their lives. Pushing these thoughts aside while Ms. Bakugo collected her thoughts, he picked up the clipboard mounted on the wall and quickly scanned the notes. We're lucky the neurological exam has already been completed, Akira said in a quiet voice, barely above a whisper, returning the clipboard to its place. Mitsuki struggled to focus her gaze on the doctor's face, trying to grasp the meaning of his words. Thousands of thoughts raced through her mind, but her rational side clearly understood how important it was to concentrate on the information the doctor was providing. I'm sorry, could you please repeat that? She said with a slight rasping in her voice, trying to speak calmly. The neurologist managed to examine him before the boy fell back asleep, he repeated, glancing through the viewing window. There's no permanent brain damage. Neurological status is normal. Mitsuki turned sharply. Her fingers, which had been resting on the glass, twitched, producing a squeak. No permanent damage, she repeated, struggling to restrain the urge to scream, unable to believe her ears. I can explain later, the doctor replied calmly. He had already revealed significantly more than he was legally allowed to. Of course, it was foolish to stop now, but information about respiratory arrest wouldn't help the current situation. Suppressing the immediate urge to demand answers, she agreed, "All right," exhaling heavily. "Is there anything else I should?" She didn't finish the sentence as the previously monotonous beeping of the machines changed to a faster rhythm. Mitsuki glanced at the monitor in the room where the green lines began to behave erratically, and the boy's expression seemed to change. His previously relaxed facial features tensed, his eyebrows drew together. "It's time for us to go in," Watanabe said curtly, opening the door slightly. The noise from the machines escaped from the room, filling the previously quiet corridors. Following immediately into the room, Mitsuki caught a glimpse of a wide glass door to her left upon entering. It appeared to lead to another identical room, but she didn't pay much attention to it at the moment. Her gaze swept across the room. The room was in gentle semi-darkness, with only the soft light from a cylindrical floor lamp in the distance dispelling the shadows. Mitsuki barely had time to take in the details of the surroundings: modern equipment, muted peach-tone decor, and most importantly the bed with Izuku's fragile figure. But all attention was drawn to the boy. Covered in sensors, with wires leading to the machines, he seemed so vulnerable. 2 blood bags hung on a stand next to the bed, with a thin red line of blood traveling through a transparent tube to the boy. A nurse in the right corner of the room caught her attention only briefly. All her focus remained on Izuku. Finally, approaching hesitantly, she could make out 2 small wings covered in white down peeking out from under the sheets. Mitsuki froze as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place in her mind. A bird-type quirk. Now many things became clear, as did the fact that little Izuku had been propped up on all sides with pillows to maintain his unusual side position. Mitsuki stood frozen, unable to tear her eyes away from the fragile wings. They seemed to twitch slightly as consciousness returned to the boy, causing the down to tremble. She took an uncertain step forward, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached out to get a better look at the newly manifested quirk. "Don't touch," the nurse's quiet, polite voice made her recoil. "The wings are sensitive, especially now. It hasn't even been 24 hours since their formation." Bakugo slowly sank into the chair next to the bed, her gaze never leaving Izuku. She noticed how his eyelashes twitched barely perceptibly, how his facial muscles tensed. It seemed as if he was struggling with something inside himself as he gradually came out of sleep. Everyone who knew the Midoriya family had assumed that their son would have a fire-controlling quirk or something similar. Even specialists leaned towards this as the most logical combination of the parents' quirks. In such a case, there would be people who could explain to the confused child how to control his newly acquired abilities, how not to harm himself or others. But Mitsuki, she was far from being a quirk specialist. In fact, she was seeing a bird-type mutation in the flesh for the first time. What can I even do? Questions tormented her mind. She was completely lost in trying to figure out how she could help and what she could say to the confused child when he woke up. Of course, the excitement with which he talked about various quirks was unparalleled. That light in his green eyes, full of joy when the topic came up. All this gave hope that this particular aspect wouldn't be a serious shock for him. But who would help the boy successfully adapt to his new abilities? This was a question the family friend would try to answer later. For now, she would simply do everything in her power and, at the very least, be there during this crucial moment. The thought of this made her heart bleed. This moment belonged to Inko, or even, Hisashi. Mitsuki felt as if she were stealing something incredibly important from this family. Something she would never be able to return. Dr. Watanabe was whispering something to the nurse, who continued to prepare various medications. His tired appearance did not escape Mitsuki's gaze. Swollen eyelids, red eyes contrasting with their deep blue color. "Will help him feel less pain when he wakes up," the doctor whispered in explanation before taking a sterile tray with 2 prepared syringes and moving around the bed. Izuku twitched slightly with his whole body, letting out a low and the machines began to emit a loud, warning signal. The nurse, with a practiced motion, pressed the button under the monitor and turned off the sound, plunging the room into silence. Mitsuki, with her heart in her throat, carefully watched, it seemed, everything at once. How the nurse prepared some kind of cloth, how the numbers on the monitors changed, every new movement of the facial muscles on the child's face in front of her. "You can hold his hand," Akira advised gently, pulling on silicone gloves over his palms. "I'm sure it will help." Mitsuki followed the advice without hesitation. Gently grasping Izuku's palm, he seemed to squeeze his fingers in response. This was probably the first good sign. She smiled slightly at the corners of her lips. Carefully adjusting a strand of green hair with her free hand, she then placed her palm over their clasped hands. They were cold, dry, and seemed to tremble slightly. Watanabe carefully pulled back the sheet to gain access to the catheter in the patient's right arm. He raised his gaze to the woman opposite. For the first time meeting each other's eyes so closely, the woman was able to see not only fatigue but also genuine concern in the doctor's eyes. For the first time in this long shift, he smiled slightly, nodded, and began administering the medication. Smiling slightly, perhaps a bit awkwardly, but genuinely for the first time in this long shift, he nodded slightly and began administering the medication. Cold. That was the first thing young Izuku felt. It seemed as if he was underwater. This cold, like a slow, thick mass, gradually enveloped the entire body, penetrating deep into the lungs and clouding vision. His consciousness balanced somewhere on the edge of the abyss, desperately trying to hold onto a thin, spiderweb-like thread leading upward, toward the light. But no matter how he tried, this cold gradually pulled him back, deeper into the abyss of oblivion. He wanted to scream, call for help, but as soon as he opened his mouth, a sharp flash of pain robbed him of the last remnants of strength that allowed him to hold on. Mitsuki did not take her eyes off the boy's face, absorbing every movement, every breath. His mouth opened slightly before his eyes squeezed shut, and the boy whimpered faintly in pain. The woman sitting next to him nervously swallowed and gripped his hand a little tighter. Her palm, lying on his hand, moved slightly in circular, soothing motions. It seemed to be the only connection between reality and the darkness in which Izuku was floundering. His whole world turned upside down in one moment, causing a terrible feeling in his stomach and unbearable dizziness. The space that had previously seemed viscous and thick disappeared in an instant, sending his consciousness into free fall. He felt as if he was falling at great speed through a swift icy stream, while fragments of ice pierced his skin. His body shuddered and began to tremble, as if trying to break free from the icy bonds of non-existence. His arms and legs, despite all the weak muscles exhausted by the painful process of Quirk awakening, sought to cling as close as possible to his chest. Mitsuki, holding his hand, felt the trembling grow. Her eyes began to sting again, but she did not let go of his palm, allowing a single tear to roll down her cheek. Continuing to hold the connection with reality for Izuku was far more important than trying to hide her true emotions. Izuku continued to fall. An unpleasant feeling grew in his stomach. He desperately tried to turn in the air. Slow down the fall. Scream. Anything could help avoid the sharp stabs of icy spikes that caused pain and numbness throughout his body. The wings fluttered, as if awakening from a long sleep. Their movements were awkward, uncertain, like a newborn child trying to move its arms for the first time. Each movement of theirs echoed with sharp pain in Izuku's body, forcing him to groan through clenched teeth. The woman, who at that moment was practically replacing his mother, without taking her eyes off what was happening, noticed how the wings were trying to instinctively hide, press themselves to their owner's body. They moved slowly, as if not understanding their own mechanism of operation, touching sensors and wires, causing new waves of pain in the boy. The world turned over again in his consciousness, causing terrible dizziness and forcing him to tense every muscle in a futile attempt to somehow stop it. He felt his body collide with something hard. A jolt of electricity ran through his entire body. In a futile attempt to call for help again, he felt only more pain. Izuku let out a quiet, heart-wrenching groan as one of his wings brushed against the edge of the bed. His lips parted slightly before snapping shut again. His face contorted in pain, but he was too weak to express his suffering in words. Only a slight crease between his brows and trembling eyelashes betrayed his torment. Mitsuki had never felt so helpless. Even more tears welled up in her eyes, slowly running down her chin and falling, leaving wet spots on her palm. She saw all too clearly how Izuku was suffering, how he was writhing in pain with every movement. But she could do nothing but hold his cold little hand. This simple gesture of affection seemed so insignificant in the face of his agony. The space around him became viscous again. The endless void that stretched out, causing dizziness, gradually thickened into black mist. The cold gradually receded, momentarily easing the pain. But as the mist around grew denser, Izuku suddenly realized it was becoming difficult to breathe. Each subsequent breath grew heavier, as if the air was gradually turning to honey. Izuku's body froze for a second, causing the heart of the woman holding his hand to stop in unison. But in the next instant, the boy was overcome by a sharp coughing fit. Bakugo felt the child's hand twitch in her grasp. The wings pressed tightly to his body. Coughs erupted from his chest in short, wrenching spasms, each one registering as sharp pain on his face. His small body convulsed with each attack, and his breathing grew increasingly ragged. Mitsuki instinctively reached out to him, but Dr. Watanabe was quicker. His face remained calm. He extended his hand back and opened his palm. Without any words or other gestures, the nurse placed a cloth she had prepared earlier into his hand. With a swift motion, he wrapped the cloth around his fingers and gently but firmly pried open the patient's jaw. His wings fluttered again as his body continued to convulse with coughing. The doctor, having used his quirk almost instantly, identified the problem once he had a view of the airways. They had expected this. Without another word, he reached back, and the nurse, like a shadow, glided to him, placing an aspirator in his palm. The room filled with the characteristic hissing of the operating compressor, which echoed off the walls of the ward. Watanabe immediately began the procedure. With movements honed by years of practice, precise and carefully measured, he began inserting the aspirator tube into the child's throat. He did not blink, so that his quirk could continue to function, giving him the best possible view. Careful not to damage the injured areas, he slowly moved deeper through the airways. Mitsuki held her breath, watching the procedure. She continued to hold Izuku's hand tightly. Her gaze darted between the child's face and the transparent tube connecting the device in the doctor's hands to the container. When the tube passed the vocal cords, the monotonous hissing gave way to an unpleasant squelching sound. Pale red liquid resembling mucus began to flow through the transparent tube, slowly filling the container. Watanabe periodically made circular motions with the aspirator. His eyes began to water. Tension and fatigue prevented him from using his quirk long enough to avoid side effects. Nevertheless, resisting the urge to close his eyes, he continued the aspiration. Izuku's entire body convulsed again in a coughing fit. The boy's eyes suddenly flew open. The green iris seemed like a thin ring encircling unusually large, dark, and deep pupils. Reacting instantly to the patient's awakening, Akira quickly removed the respirator. The boy let out a weak wheeze. His pupils. As soon as the device was completely removed, the doctor released the hand holding the child's jaw and allowed himself to finally blink, simultaneously taking a step back. As the doctor retreated, his place was taken by the nurse. She had a metal container in her hands. As if on cue, little Izuku was once again gripped by a coughing fit. Being already conscious, he reflexively lifted his head off the pillow. The nurse, quickly reacting, gently supported the boy's head with her free hand. The cough, though still painful, was no longer as violent as before. With the next spasm, a large lump of mucus came up from his throat. It slid down his lips and fell into the prepared metal tray. Izuku automatically took a deep breath and coughed again on the exhale, allowing the remaining irritant to leave his throat. His body convulsed with effort, and his wings trembled slightly in rhythm with his movements. The last of the irritating fluid finally left his throat, bringing at least some relief. Mitsuki, never taking her eyes off the scene, noticed how, after the next breath, his small body convulsed with the first sob, which quickly escalated into desperate crying. Tears streamed in an uninterrupted flow from his closed eyelids, leaving wet tracks on his pale cheeks. His crying was so defenseless, so childlike. The nurse, wasting no time, handed Mitsuki a clean handkerchief. This woman needed no instructions on what to do with it, she was a mother too. Releasing Izuku's hand for the first time, she took it and, gently pushing her chair aside, knelt closer to the child's face on the bed. Shoo, it's okay, she whispered, gently wiping the tears from his face. It's all over now. You're safe. Her voice was soft and soothing, but Izuku sobbed desperately, releasing all the fear and pain that had gripped his entire body. His breathing became more intermittent, and his sobs grew louder. Mitsuki leaned forward, thinking of nothing but calming this small, suffering child. Her embrace was firm yet gentle, exactly as it should be in moments of despair. Izuku, exhausted by pain and fear, instinctively clung to her, seeking protection and comfort. His fingers, weak but filled with a desperate need for support, held tightly to her clothes. She bent over him, feeling his heart beating, his wings trembling under her hand. She stroked his head, running her fingers through his soft green locks, and whispered words of comfort that she hoped would reach his exhausted consciousness. It seemed as if the whole world had narrowed down to this small space where only the two of them existed. The doctors, the hospital, the entire city with its heroes and villains, noisy roadworks, and the endless tapping of fingers on keyboards in overloaded offices, all of it remained somewhere beyond. It became almost unreal, a faint memory at the back of the mind. Only the metallic smell from the remnants of dried blood in his hair remained as a reminder of everything that had been left behind. She was completely unaware of what was happening in the ward at that moment. There was a distant, muffled clinking of something metallic. Barely audible footsteps echoed at the edge of her consciousness. She knew Dr. Watanabe was performing some manipulations with the equipment around, and her eyes could see the nurse injecting something into the foredrip. But she didn't really register it. At that moment, for Mitsuki, there was only the child's spasmodic breathing and the feeling of his heart beating. She seemed to have dissolved in these simple yet crucial signs of life, forgetting everything else. Gradually, Izuku's crying grew quieter. His breathing slowly began to even out. His body relaxed. The pain, like barbed wire, that had been squeezing the woman's heart all this time, preventing her from taking a full breath, slowly loosened its grip. Over time, the sobs gave way to small uhs, and the boy's entire body finally stopped shaking and convulsing. His muscles slowly relaxed, though his fingers continued to grip tightly to the clothes of the person holding him. The pain and cold receded into the background, leaving only weakness and a slight tingling sensation. He felt as if a bright beam of light was slowly dispersing the dark fog around him. Mitsuki continued to gently slide his head, whispering words of comfort. The warmth of her palms. The texture of the fabric that the child could feel with his fingertips. All of this was like a beacon guiding him through the darkness. Gradually moving towards this light, his grip slowly weakened, and the world around him grew brighter. Each subsequent breath seemed easier. The woman felt the small hands release her clothes. The muscles under her palms tensed slightly, and he slowly attempted to pull away. His eyes, heavy with fatigue, opened slightly. He blinked several times, trying to clear the white veil obscuring his vision. The world appeared blurry, as if seen through fogged glass. His eyes tried to focus, but the surroundings still appeared as fuzzy spots. Having finally unclenched his hand and released Mitsuki's clothes, he let out a slight sob that gradually grew into a prolonged His movements were slow and cautious, as if his limbs were numb. The back of his hand tried to wipe his eyes, but this movement caused a grimace of pain to distort his face. Mitsuki noticed this and gently stopped him. "Sure, don't rush," she whispered. "Let me." She turned her head slightly, wanting to ask for tissues, but the desired package was already lying on the bed nearby. Without thinking about how or when it got there, she lightly took a couple of soft tissues. They were immediately saturated with glycerin secreted by her body due to her quirk. Izuku felt someone gently move his hand, touching only with fingertips. Something soft and cool touched his eyelids and cheeks, soothing his tear-stained skin. The movements were almost weightless but confident. The boy blinked again. This time, the outlines of the room became clearer, though everything still seemed too bright. His irises, a deep green, seemed to shimmer slightly in the dim light of the ward. Those eyes had always been so similar to his mother's, but now they appeared somewhat different. As if obsidian flecks had appeared in the emeralds, shimmering in the rays of sunlight. The boy tried to focus his gaze on the face of the person in front of him but couldn't recognize it. He clearly saw the smooth curve of the nose, slightly narrowed eyes, a slight smile and swollen lips. But the picture just wouldn't come together. He blinked several more times, trying to finally focus on the woman's face. It was clear, yet he couldn't piece the features together. He attempted to turn over from his uncomfortable position on his side to his back. He wanted to sit up to try looking from a different angle, but his body wouldn't obey. It felt too heavy, as if he were covered in a lead blanket. Mitsuki, noticing the child's hesitant attempt to turn, gently placed her palm on his right shoulder to stop him. Seeing no resistance, she leaned a little closer to better observe his reaction. "Do you recognize me, Izuku?" she asked quietly in a gentle voice. The boy's eyelids trembled slightly. His green eyes continued to study her face in a desperate attempt to match what he saw with the familiar voice. Confusion was evident in his gaze. Noticing this, she gently added, "It's me, Mitsuki, Katsuki's mom." Her voice was soft and soothing, but a hint of anxiety flashed in her red eyes. She watched as the boy's lower lip trembled with fear and sadness that he couldn't recognize her face. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but only a quiet croak came from his throat. The child coughed again, his Adam's apple moved in an attempt to push the words out. He tried to speak again, but his tongue felt too big and numb, as if his mouth was stuffed with cotton. Every attempt to pronounce a word was met with pain and tension in his throat. Mitsuki cast a concerned glance at Dr. Watanabe, who had stepped closer, noticing the patient's confusion and fear. He gently motioned for her to wait a moment, as if saying, "It's okay. I'm here if he gets worse." After several painful seconds of struggling with his own body, Izuku finally managed to get himself under control. His voice came out indistinct, hoarse, and raspy, but the words finally broke through the pain. "I recognized your voice," he coughed again, "but I don't recognize your face." A sad sob followed this phrase, his lower lip trembled, and his eyes filled with tears again. The doctor carefully knelt down next to the hospital bed. "Hey, kid, hello," he greeted the child in a quiet voice. "I'm the doctor. My name is Watanabe. Can you look at me?" Izuku was distracted by the new, unfamiliar voice. He cautiously turned his head and blinked again to get rid of the tears and focus on the face of the person in front of him. He saw him clearly, blue eyes, slightly disheveled but neatly styled light hair, a slight smile that, despite its subtlety, was still soothing. But as soon as the boy blinked again and tried to examine the face as a whole, it just didn't look right. The doctor, noticing that the patient seemed even more upset, hurried to unclip his badge from his coat, lifting it to face level so that the child could see it well. "Do you see the picture?" he asked, pointing to the hospital logo with an owl on it. Receiving an uncertain, barely noticeable nod in response, Watanabe smiled slightly. "Can you tell me what kind of animal this is?" he asked softly. Izuku slowly shifted his gaze to the badge. The face in the photo seemed just as wrong, but before he could become even more upset, his gaze finally reached the image. He opened his mouth to answer, but his tongue still wouldn't obey him. Trying his best, he finally managed to respond in a barely audible, erratic and hoarse voice. "That's an owl." "You did great," Akira concluded. His smile widened, and when he noticed the boy reacting with a slight movement of his lips in an involuntary attempt to mimic it, the doctor was finally convinced that his guess had been correct. Mitsuki, watching this scene, could exhale with slight relief. The smile on the doctor's face didn't seem like a mere attempt to comfort the boy. For perhaps the first time in their short acquaintance, it was genuine and sincere. Although Izuku's eyelids felt Heavier with each passing moment and every blink grew longer, he desperately resisted the sudden wave of fatigue that had intensified. "Ma," he tried to say, "where are Ma? Pa?" This question was like an icy shower that doused the woman. It pulled her out of that small, peaceful space, and the entire weight of the world seemed to descend on her shoulders again. She swallowed with a tremor and leaned slightly closer. "They'll be here soon, baby," she assured him with all the confidence she could muster at that moment. "They know you're here and are very worried." Once upon a time, Mitsuki had promised herself she would never lie to children. But now, despite her unwavering faith in Inko's safety, despite her belief that her friend would spare no effort to comfort and console her son, that tiny spark of doubt that had flared up earlier was enough to make her feel a painful pang of guilt. Tears welled up in the child's eyes again. "It hurts," he hummed pitifully. "I want Ma." He seemed to be losing the last remnants of the little strength that had allowed him to stay awake. "Where's Pa?" He spoke more quietly. "Ma," he repeated plaintively, but his words trailed off, sounding like a gentle breeze before he slipped back into Morpheus' embrace. An immediate silence fell in the room. Izuku's breathing was calm and steady. There were tear tracks on his face, and his eyebrows drooped slightly toward his nose, reflecting genuine, childish resentment. And despite everything, this expression seemed much more alive than the mask of pain that Mitsuki had first seen on him that day. Mitsuki sat nearby, unable to tear her eyes away from the sleeping boy. Her heart ached with pain and guilt even more. She knew she had promised herself to be honest. But now, looking at this child who had lost so much and who so desperately needed comfort, she couldn't find the strength to tell the truth. The silence in the ward was deafening. The only sound was Izuku's quiet, measured breathing. Mitsuki gently wiped the tears from his face, trying not to wake him. In that moment, she realized that sometimes the truth could be too heavy a burden for children's shoulders, and perhaps sometimes a white lie was the only way to prevent them from being shattered. In the dim light of the ward, the rhythmic sounds of medical equipment echoed steadily and monotonously, like the ticking of a clock. The beeping of the heart monitor blended with the faint hum of the infusion pump wove an eerie, almost hypnotic tapestry of sound, lulling the mind into a fragile trance that both relaxed and served as a constant reminder of the fragility of life. The silence that filled the space for several more minutes after the boy had fallen back asleep no longer seemed like a lull before the storm. It felt like an anxious yet much-needed pause in the endless wandering through the darkness. The inner fire of anxiety had subsided slightly, but unanswered questions, like dry branches in a raging fire, continued to stoke the flames of anxiety. A leaden weight settled like a stone in her solar plexus, pressing down with unrelenting force, and a heat from unshed tears pulsed in her eyes. Mitsuki, sitting in a chair next to the bed, could not tear her gaze away from the boy. Her gentle fingers glided over his matted green locks. There was something sacred in this simple act of care, something that helped her feel connected to reality despite all the worries and doubts. Dr. Watanabe gently placed his hand on the woman's forearm in a soft, soothing gesture. This simple act of support seemed like more than any words could convey. It contained all his professional empathy, understanding, and readiness to be there in this difficult moment. But eternal silence was an unattainable luxury. There was still too much to discuss before moving on. Mitsuki cleared her throat carefully, released the green locks, and wiped her face, removing the slightly dried tear tracks. "Thank you," she whispered, rising from her crouching position and sitting back down on the chair next to the bed. Her movements were fluid, almost ritualistic, as if she feared disturbing the fragile balance of the moment. In response, he gave a warm smile and a sincere look. His eyes, bloodshot eyes, gleaming faintly in the soft lamplight, betrayed his exhaustion of the floor lamp, revealed fatigue. It didn't matter whether this crack in his professional mask reflected the scars on his heart left by today's events or the consequences of an exhausting shift without a moment's rest. "I'm sure you still have many questions," he said quietly but confidently, keeping his voice steady. "We can step out so as not to disturb the boy," he added, shifting his gaze to the child's face lying nearby. Although the fear in her and the slightly reddened eyes still made her heart shudder, Izuku did not appear as pale, exhausted, and in pain as he had been before he first regained consciousness. And although during his brief awakening his consciousness had remained confused, preventing him from fully understanding where he was and what was happening to him, this was quite understandable given the painkillers and both emotional and physical exhaustion. Even adults, regaining consciousness after surgery, rarely regained mental clarity immediately. The first few hours almost always passed in a chaotic balancing act on the edge of consciousness, which constantly slipped into brief sleep. The fact that the boy was able to formulate his thoughts and even answer questions was a sign of nothing less than an enormous level of resilience. Despite his young age, he demonstrated remarkable fortitude. This fact left little doubt that he would be able to fully recover physically in the shortest possible time. Unfortunately, the same could not be said about his emotional state. But right now, it is important not to get ahead of ourselves and move forward slowly, one step at a time. Mitsuki looked at Izuku again, anxiety in her eyes. Her soul was torn between the desire to stay here with him until the end and not leave until the child was in his mother's arms. But at the same time, she understood that Inko would also need solid support to help her get back on her feet and move forward. After all, it was adults who suffered such shocks more severely. Children have an amazing ability to forget the bad, recover quickly, and move forward. Izuku, thanks to his young age and natural resilience, would probably be able to leave this terrible episode behind. The decision was not easy, but she knew she could help him. Much more by allowing him and his mother to be together as soon as possible. The woman took a deep breath and slowly got up from the chair. Dr. Watanabe followed her example and also rose from his squatting position. His knees cracked slightly, and he seemed to lose his balance for a second. But his face still bore a gentle smile, giving no sign that he was feeling tired. "Takahashi-kun, thank you for your help," he thanked the nurse, bowing his head. "And for allowing Miss Bakugo to stay here," he added, bowing even lower. "Oh, don't mention it," she replied, bowing in response. When they both raised their heads, the nurse added, "Only next time, when you try to secretly bring someone into the ward, at least call that person by the name written on her badge." Mitsuki was slightly surprised and suddenly looked at the badge attached to the coat hanging on the back of the chair. This light, joking remark from the nurse caused a quiet laugh between her and the doctor, allowing them to calm down a bit and breathe more freely. The nurse nodded understandingly at both of them, making it clear that everything was under control and that the little patient would be cared for with all the love while they were gone. Mitsuki, feeling the support and confidence from the medical staff, slowly headed towards the exit, following Watanabe. The cool air filled with the smell of antiseptic in the hospital hallway now felt like a fresh breeze after a long heat. This space was no longer filled with that thick, oppressive atmosphere that chilled to the bone. The silence was replaced by muffled voices belonging to other patients and medical staff. Nurses came in and out of numerous doors leading to individual wards. The department was gradually filling with life. Feeling this significant change in atmosphere, the woman pondered, "How much time has passed while we were in there?" she asked herself aloud. "About 20 to 25 minutes, the doctor replied, not quite a statement, not quite a question. "Judging by the fact that the morning rounds have begun, it's around 8 now." Mitsuki took out her phone and looked at the screen. Watanabe was right, it was just after 8 in the morning. There were no messages or calls from her husband either. Considering that she had received a call from the doctor at 7 a.m. when the shop had just opened, only an hour had passed since then, and about 40 minutes since they had first met. Just 1 hour. Just an hour ago, her life seemed normal, and now she found herself in the center of some incredible story that would be hard to believe if someone else were retelling these events. Returning her phone to her pocket, she rubbed her left eye with the back of her hand. The frantic pace of recent events was causing a headache, and dehydration from crying wasn't helping at all. "Please, this way," the doctor said, not allowing Mitsuki to completely sink into her thoughts. Watanabe opened a nondescript white door, inviting her to enter. "This is the staff break room," he explained. "There won't be anyone here at least until the morning rounds are completed." Quietly thanking him, the woman followed into the designated room. The decor was modest, a small window through which rays of sun fell. 2 rather old-looking sofas with a coffee table. A small TV and a kitchen counter on the opposite wall with a mini fridge, sink, and coffee machine. Having fully entered the room, she felt tension gradually leaving her. The room turned out to be exactly the place where one could catch their breath and collect their thoughts. Quiet, calm, and cozy. Dr. Watanabe closed the door behind them and walked over to the coffee machine. Coffee? Tea? He asked without turning around. Coffee, please, Mitsuki replied, sinking onto one of the sofas. She looked around, noting the details. Several medical magazines on the table, a calendar on the wall with crossed-out dates. A few minutes later, the sound of a coffee grinder filled the small room with a rich aroma. The woman leaned her head back against the sofa, staring at the ceiling, replaying all the events in her mind. Why couldn't he recognize me? She asked without lowering her head, more like thinking aloud. Though it seemed alarming, the doctor's calmness at that moment allowed her to think it wasn't as serious as it might seem. Maybe it's the effects of anesthesia? She continued the thought, no longer voicing it. The sound of the coffee grinder stopped. I didn't manage to check his eyes with my quirk for long enough, Akira replied, taking 2 mugs from the top shelf. But I'm sure there's nothing wrong with his vision. Perhaps even more than that, he added, placing a mug under the coffee machine's spout and turning it on. What do you mean? Mitsuki clarified, raising her head to look at the doctor. Watanabe turned around and leaned his hands on the countertop behind him, continuing, You said young Midoriya reacted strongly to bright light and sound? The woman frowned slightly, receiving another question instead of an answer, but nevertheless replied, As far as I know, yes, she nodded, but I haven't noticed it myself. I only heard it from Inko. The coffee machine beeped briefly, signaling readiness. The doctor turned to replace the mug and repeat the process. How long has this been going on? About a year ago, I think? Mitsuki replied, looking up at the ceiling and thinking for a second. Now that I think about it, my son also mentioned something like that. They attend the same children's group, she added. When the second mug was ready, Akira took one in each hand. Here you are, he said, placing one mug on the coffee table. Without releasing the second from his right hand, he sat down on the opposite sofa. Thank you, the woman replied briefly, wrapping both hands around the coffee mug and bringing it to her lips, inhaling the aroma deeply before taking a sip. The density of light-sensitive cells in his eyes is much higher than in most people, Watanabe explained, also taking a sip. Sensitivity to light was briefly mentioned in the neurologist's notes. He paused for a second, fixing his gaze on the drink in his hands. After that, the lights in the ward were dimmed. Most likely, when he woke up, he saw the room as brightly lit. Is this related to his quirk? Mitsuki asked, turning slightly closer. The first signs appeared long ago? The doctor didn't answer. He just kept watching the bubbles slowly rising to the surface of the coffee in his mug, forming a light foam. The next question is off the record, but it might become official depending on your answer, he finally said, raising his eyes to look the woman straight in the eyes. His face was tense, his jaw was slightly clenched, his eyebrows lowered. Mitsuki froze, feeling a chill run down her spine. She put her mug on the coffee table and straightened her shoulders. With a slight nod, urging him to ask the question, she returned his gaze, sharp as a dagger. Well, she could play this game too. Have you ever noticed any signs of abuse in Midoriya Izuku? He said slowly, carefully measuring the sound of each individual syllable. Bruises, abrasions, flinching at touch? At that moment, Mitsuki was glad she had put her mug on the table. If she had been drinking at that moment, she would have spit out all the coffee in shock. However, she was still in shock. The most shocking thing about all of this was that she was actually considering the question instead of immediately rejecting it. I haven't noticed anything like that, she replied after a second. Are you thinking? She tried to ask a question but was interrupted. Please, we need a clear answer. Yes or no, the doctor said, also placing his mug on the table. This greatly determines our further actions. No, the woman answered clearly. Hisashi is a JR, of course, but he cared about his son, she had wanted to say, but abruptly stopped, wondering whether to finish the sentence. About Izuku, she finally finished. Good, Watanabe replied. Let's put this question aside for now, he added. His face seemed to relax at that moment. He picked up his mug again and leaned back against the sofa. Bakugo followed suit. Taking another sip, she wondered whether to insist on this or really wait until more important issues were resolved. After a couple of seconds, she decided to settle somewhere in the middle. "Are you planning to involve the police?" she asked, feeling terrible for even entertaining such thoughts. But nevertheless, earlier she could not have imagined learning what she had learned today. In this context, it made sense to consider any options, no matter how painful and terrible it was. "I should have done it already," the doctor replied. "But I decided to talk to you first." He took another sip of coffee and inhaled deeply. Further actions depend on what Mrs. Midoriya says after she wakes up. It was difficult for Mitsuki to think about this right now. Her interlocutor was right. It was better to resolve this issue later when the situation became clearer. She was about to change the subject to Inko herself, completely forgetting her first question, but Watanabe continued. "While Mrs. Midoriya's behavior and actions can be explained by shock, her husband's actions fall under the definition of criminal negligence." It was difficult for the family friend to respond to that. This was not a speculation or a thought aloud. In their current reality, it was a fact that would be difficult to explain even if Hizashi got back in touch. This caused her fingers to involuntarily tighten around the mug. The minute she wished she could punch that "You still haven't answered my previous question," she said, remembering this as soon as her thoughts returned to the child. The doctor, for his part, was also glad to change the subject. "It's prosopagnosia," he replied with surprising calmness in his voice. "He can't recognize faces. Since there's no brain damage, it's most likely a weakness inherent in his quirk." Prosopagnosia, Mitsuki repeated slowly, trying to comprehend the new word. But how is this connected to his quirk? And why has it only manifested now? Many questions immediately arose in Mitsuki's mind. The repeated mention of brain damage seemed the most important right now. She was about to ask about it, but Watanabe, anticipating the wave of questions that was about to overwhelm him, stopped her attempt with a gentle gesture. "This is a reasonable assumption," he began, placing his now empty mug on the table. "This diagnosis will need to be confirmed by a neurologist. Right now, I can only assume that his ability to recognize faces has always been impaired. It just became clearly evident only with the development of his quirk." "Wait, stop," Mitsuki interrupted him, raising both hands in a corresponding gesture. "Are you saying that his quirk somehow affects the brain? His ability to perceive reality?" The doctor nodded. "This is exactly what little I am now completely sure of," he said, resting his elbows on his knees and folding his hands in a tent. "The X-rays show very dense bundles of nerve tissue in the area where the wings attach. They are directly connected to the spinal cord." He shifted his gaze to his interlocutor. "The nerve endings go to each individual feather follicle, along with an extensive network of blood vessels. I confirmed both of these facts using my quirk during the examination." Mitsuki raised her eyebrows in surprise, digesting the information. After finishing the last of her coffee, she placed her mug on the table. "So, these wings aren't just limbs?" "We have every reason to say that they aren't," he nodded. "There are fewer than 10 people registered in all of Japan with such quirks, and most of the data on them is classified." He paused briefly, unsure whether to share this particular detail. Deciding not to dwell on the fact that the data was classified, the woman wanted to find out a little more. "But why then? Why can't he recognize faces? How is it connected to the wings?" Dr. Watanabe picked up both empty mugs and got up from the sofa. "The load on the central nervous system has seriously increased," he explained, heading towards the sink. "New limbs themselves require a lot of brain resources for their control, and here we're talking about a very," he emphasized this word with intonation, "very large number of new nerve connections. His body is now redistributing resources, focusing on the development of new abilities. This may temporarily affect other functions. What will happen next? Are these changes irreversible?" Mitsuki asked, listening attentively to every new word her interlocutor said. "I can't say that," the doctor admitted. He turned on the water to rinse the mugs. "A quirk specialist will be able to determine that after examining him," He finished, turned off the tap, and reached for a towel. Mitsuki froze for a moment, processing what she had heard. Her gaze became sharper as she asked her next question. Will he be able to fly? With wings like these? Watanabe put the mugs away and turned around, leaning his back and arms against the counter behind him. The ability to fly is never directly connected to wings, he said quite categorically. There are a huge number of quirks that allow flight without wing manifestation. Also, in documented cases of wing quirks, the ability to fly is never directly linked to the wings themselves. Mitsuki raised her eyebrows in surprise, not expecting such an answer. But how is that possible? She asked. If not the wings, then what enables flight? Watanabe thoughtfully rubbed his chin. Usually, it's connected to other abilities, he explained. For example, anti-gravity quirks, creating air currents, or even manipulating one's own body mass. Wings in such cases often serve more as an aesthetic element or an additional flight control tool. The woman frowned, trying to process this information. So, Izuku's wings could just be decorative? A hint of disappointment was audible in her voice. Not exactly, the doctor shook his head, crossing his arms over his chest while still leaning against the counter. They definitely serve some function since the body is expending so many resources on their development. Perhaps they're connected to other aspects of his quirk that we don't know about yet. Mitsuki nodded thoughtfully. Is there a chance he might still be able to fly? She persisted. After all, wings seem so natural for flight. Watanabe shrugged. The nature of quirks often defies common sense, he replied. We can't rule out any possibilities. The doctor's interlocutor let out a disappointed sigh. For some reason, this particular aspect had made her more energetic than usual. Am I correct in understanding that his weight loss is directly connected to the development of his quirk? She asked after a few seconds. Both yes and no, the doctor replied evasively. No, because the development seems to have started a long time ago. Yes, because the final stage was very rapid. Mitsuki didn't understand this. But her pride didn't allow her to ask the question again. And besides, she had understood enough for her guess to be confirmed. What exactly happened that night? She finally decided to ask. I don't know that for sure, Akira was forced to admit. And even if I did, I don't consider myself entitled to talk about it. You should ask Mrs. Midoriya directly. It seemed that this was where Dr. Watanabe drew the line he could no longer cross as a doctor. He could afford to discuss the boy's quirk because the woman in front of him obviously knew this family very well and empathized greatly. And it could also be important both for the child himself and to help his mother if someone else could help explain to her what was happening. And although he could only talk about physiological aspects, it would still be important for further studying the quirk under the supervision of a specialist. Mitsuki felt irritation rising inside her. She was used to getting clear answers, not these medical riddles. But you're a doctor, she insisted. There must be some assumptions based on Inko's and Izuku's conditions? Watanabe shook his head, his face remaining inscrutable. As a doctor, I can only state the facts, he replied. Inko's condition indicates severe stress and emotional exhaustion. As for Izuku, he will recover quickly. He will be falling asleep and waking up for the next 12 hours before finally coming to his senses. He decided to omit other details that were known to him, in particular, the abundant amount of blood both on the child's father and on him. Of course, he could build a fairly clear picture of the events in his head, but in fact, it was nothing more than simple speculation. What will happen after that? His interlocutor clarified. Will there be any other consequences that Inko and I should prepare for? Akira pushed himself away from the counter and looked thoughtfully out the window. He will most likely have a scar on his tongue, he replied, returning his gaze to the person in front of him. The anemia will go away in a couple of days. The pain will probably last longer, but it will be more like muscle pain after a workout. Okay, Mitsuki stated, ready to stop there for now. They spent several more minutes in complete silence, listening to the sounds from the corridor. It was necessary to spend several minutes in silence. The desire to ask more questions struggled in Mitsuki's head with the understanding that right now, in her current emotional state, She would hardly even be able to truly comprehend the answers. It was necessary to talk to her friend before they could move forward. They would still need to talk to Hisashi, but right now it seemed to her that she would kill him on sight before he could even open his mouth. Taking a deep breath, the woman finally broke the silence. "When can we visit Inko? How soon will she come to her senses?" she asked, rising from the sofa. "She's just sleeping and recovering from severe stress," the doctor replied. "I think we can go to her right now. She should be fine by now." "Great." Her voice sounded firm but with a note of anxiety. "I want to be there when she wakes up," she added. "Then please." Watanabe opened the door slightly, again allowing the girl to go first. "I think she'll wake up very soon." "Just please," he warned, carefully closing the door. "Don't try to wake her up. After such a shock, she might react too intensely." "I understand," Mitsuki replied, her gaze once again scanning the sterile hospital walls as they fell back into silence, preparing for what the conversation with Inko might bring. They didn't walk far before reaching their destination. "We didn't want them to be too far apart," the doctor explained, stopping at the slight door. Soft light from the room spilled into the corridor, creating a slightly more cozy yet unsettling atmosphere. Watanabe gently knocked and, without waiting for a response, slightly opened the door wider. This room was quite different from the ward where Izuku was placed. There was almost no complex medical equipment, just several soft couches like those you'd expect to find in a psychologist's office. A small desk in the corner and several potted plants on the windowsill. Fresh air filled the room through the window, and the light, though quite bright, was warm and created a relaxing atmosphere. Inko lay on one of the couches. The doctor immediately noted the improvement in her complexion. The last time he visited her, she had seemed as pale as marble. Now, it seemed, her natural color had returned, while her eyes were swollen from crying. Overall, Midoriya looked much more peaceful. Mitsuki froze in the doorway, carefully examining her friend. Her heart filled with relief at the sight of how Inko looked now, not as exhausted as she had imagined. Having been prepared for many worse scenarios, seeing that everything was almost okay brought immense relief. "Inko," she whispered, taking a step forward. Her voice trembled with overwhelming emotions. Slowly approaching the couch, Mitsuki knelt beside her friend, not taking her eyes off her. She examined her face again, the slight blush on her cheeks, how calmly Inko was breathing, how softly the strands of her dark green hair fell over her face, their tips gleaming and shimmering in the sunlight. "God, Ingo, you look better," she admitted, quietly muttering to herself and feeling a lump rise in her throat. "I was so worried about you." Her fingers gently touched her friend's hand. In response, she seemed to stir slightly, and Mitsuki held her breath, afraid to startle this barely noticeable movement. Inko slowly opened her eyes, and a look of confusion flashed in her gaze, followed by recognition. "Mitsuki?" Her friend's voice was weak, but already had familiar notes in it. "Yes, it's me," Mitsuki whispered, feeling tears of relief well up in her eyes. "I'm here." Midoriya sat up slightly in bed and looked around slowly, rubbing her eyelids to clear the sleepiness and remove the dryness from the long and intense crying. The friend didn't take her eyes off her, noting every detail, how Inko's fingers trembled, how carefully she moved, how she winced from the bright light. At that moment, she seemed so vulnerable, but at the same time so close to who she had always been. Loving, gentle, slightly shy, and a bit fearful. "Where?" Midoriya tried to ask, but coughed before finishing the question. "Where am I? What happened?" she finally managed to say after clearing her throat. "You're in the hospital, Midoriya-sama," Dr. Watanabe interjected. "Do you remember what happened?" he asked, carefully approaching the couch and opening the door of the nearby cabinet. Inko froze for a moment, as if trying to gather scattered fragments of memory. A grimace of pain, not physical but mental, twisted her face. "Izuku," she whispered, and fear appeared in her eyes, tears welling up again. "What happened to my boy?" she asked quietly, in a hoarse voice. An unwelcome chill ran down Mitsuki's spine, causing an unpleasant feeling of anxiety to resurface in her stomach. She had already opened her mouth to answer, but the doctor beat her to it. He's fine now, just resting, he said confidently, with a gentle smile on his face. He took a blood pressure monitor from the bedside table and carefully closed the door. You'll be able to see your son very soon, Watanabe added, looking directly into Midoriya Inko's wet eyes. May I? He asked casually, showing the medical instrument in his hands. Inko froze, her gaze darting to the instrument in the doctor's hands. Mitsuki noticed her friend swallowing, trying to cope with her anxiety. Yes, of course, Inko whispered, extending her hand. Her voice trembled, but she tried to hold herself together. Thousands of thoughts raced through her mind at breakneck speed, trying to recall specific details of what had happened. Any details at all. But instead, there was only a solid white fog, only a feeling telling her that her son was in danger. Watanabe acted professionally yet with extraordinary delicacy. He carefully put the cuff on Inko's arm, his fingers warm and confident. Tell me what you remember from last night? He asked, adjusting the device. I remember. Midoriya continued trying to recall, but the more she tried, the stronger the headache began to overcome her. She squeezed one eye shut and rubbed it forcefully with the back of her hand, trying to dispel the painful fog in her head. Her face contorted with tension, and the fingers of her other hand gripped the edge of the couch. Mitsuki, noticing this, reacted instantly. Don't strain yourself so much, Inko, she comforted. The main thing is that everything is fine now. Dr. Watanabe, not looking up from his task, added, You experienced severe shock. Don't try to remember the entire sequence, he advised, finishing the blood pressure measurement and removing the cuff. Just tell me what you remember last. Oh God! Inko suddenly cried, turning sharply to face her friend. Her eyes seemed to fill with horror again, and tears streamed down her cheeks. Hisashi! My husband, has he returned? She turned her head sharply toward the doctor, her voice trembling slightly with fear. But in response, there was only a sympathetic, yet negative nod of the head. Mitsuki frowned, her face contorted with irritation. The fact that the image of her friend's brainless spouse was the first to surface in her memory caused a wave of indignation in her soul. Exchanging a meaningful glance with Dr. Watanabe, she barely restrained herself from rolling her eyes. Inko-sen, please calm down, the doctor said softly, carefully putting the tonometer back on the bedside table. Let's talk about this calmly, he added, looking the patient straight in the eyes with an encouraging smile. Bakugo-san will help you here, she can assist. Why are you calling me Mrs.? Mitsuki asked quietly, more to the void. But both Dr. Watanabe and Inko obviously heard it and cast questioning glances in her direction. Watanabe raised one eyebrow in bewilderment. Her friend, unlike the doctor, seemed to smile slightly despite the tears and anxiety. Inko felt a bit lighter seeing that Mitsuki was behaving as she always did. Realizing she had said something inappropriate, Bakugo hurried to correct herself. I just thought you weren't Japanese. But you call Inko Midoriya-san, and I... She tried to explain her question, gesturing in the air. Never mind. Forget I said that, she added with a sigh. All right, Watanabe smiled, bowing his head in silent apology. The fact that his patient seemed to have relaxed a bit was a good bonus to this small misunderstanding. But he still made a mental note to apologize properly later. Clearing his throat, he continued, Your husband. The doctor paused, carefully observing the patient's reaction. His gaze was gentle yet penetrating. Inko tensed her entire body, lowering her head to look at the thin blanket in her lap. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself, but tears of pain from these memories flooded her vision more and more, and the lump in her throat seemed ready to deprive her of speech at any moment. Midoriya began, as several drops fell onto the blanket, leaving wet marks. He said he couldn't stay with us anymore. She sobbed and covered her face with her hands. And that he needed a break. The woman broke down on the last word, her crying turning into full-blown sobs. Mitsuki froze, watching her friend's emotional pain. Her own irritation receded before genuine sympathy. Dr. Watanabe leaned forward at that moment, his professional composure preventing emotions from showing on his face, but deep empathy was visible in his eyes. Midoriya-san, he said softly, may I bring you some tissues? They're right over there. Bakugo-san will stay with you, he clarified, assuming that if he got up and left, it might be misinterpreted. No. No need, Inko replied, wiping her tears with the sides of her hands. I can do it myself. She sniffed loudly and, with a blurry gaze, pulled the tissue box toward her using her quirk. As soon as the box was in her hands, Midoriya immediately took out a tissue and blew her nose. Can you tell me when this happened? The doctor asked carefully, as the woman in front of him seemed to have calmed down enough to continue. In fact, he already had a pretty good idea of the time frame, but he needed to clarify. Inko continued to sob, her hands trembling as she held the tissues, trying to cope with her emotions. Mitsuki, without saying a word, moved closer to her friend and hugged her, allowing her to cry. It happened right before her voice faltered. It was dawn. She tried to remember more clearly. Then it seems, you came? The woman asked carefully, raising her head and looking closely at the doctor's face, slightly squinting, as if the memories were returning the faster she looked. Did he say why he was leaving? Watanabe continued to ask. His face remained impassive. Why did he need a break? It's Izuku, she answered, looking away as tears welled up anew. He couldn't accept Midoriya-kun's new quirk? The doctor clarified. Did this whole situation cause such a reaction? He paused. But when there was no response, he added, or maybe because he found out that Izuku isn't his son? This was blatant pressure. Akira felt nauseous from having to use such methods. But the situation seemed to be such. He had already broken many rules. If they didn't get answers now, all this would have been in vain. Inko froze as if time had stopped. Her eyes widened in horror, and her hands gripping the tissues turned white with tension. What are you saying? She whispered, her voice trembling like thin ice on the surface of water. Her mind raced, words caught in her throat, but after a minute she was still able to answer. He talked about it. Mitsuki felt the blood drain from her face. She hugged her friend tighter, exchanging a glance with the doctor. She couldn't approve of putting such pressure on her friend, but on the other hand, she understood everything perfectly. Right now, she would simply be there and let the professional handle it. Midoriya-san, listen. Dr. Watanabe moved a little closer, his voice becoming quieter and softer. I'm asking these questions because they're important for understanding the situation. Everything you say will remain between us. Inko shook her head, her lips trembling. No, that's not true, she denied, already understanding what question would follow next. I never did that, she declared loudly, her face flushed. I've never even been with another man, she added much more quietly, looking away as if embarrassed by this particular fact. Mitsuki felt everything tighten inside with pain for her friend. She saw how Inko was suffering from these questions, how her composure was falling apart at the seams. Inko, look at me, Mitsuki began gently, pulling back slightly so they could see each other's faces. No one is accusing you. The doctor is just trying to understand the situation to help you both. She noticed how Inko looked away and bit her lips slightly, but nevertheless seemed to relax slightly in her friend's embrace. Inko swallowed, trying to cope with her emotions. Her voice trembled as she spoke. I just want everything to be okay with Izuku. Everything else doesn't matter. She sobbed loudly again and covered her face with her hands as tears began to flow anew. I'm such a terrible mother. Inko, listen to me carefully. Mitsuki gently moved her friend's palms away and held her face in her own, forcing her to look into her eyes. You're not a terrible mother. Not at all. You're the most loving and caring mom a child could ever dream of. Her voice was firm and confident, filled with genuine concern. You're doing everything possible to protect your son, Mitsuki continued, and that shows how strong and selfless you are. Unfortunately, Dr. Watanabe couldn't agree with these statements. He didn't know what really happened, but he remembered Hisashi's look, filled with all-encompassing fear. How the man's entire clothing and even face were covered in blood. And he clearly remembered how distant and, without exaggeration, indifferent Inko seemed. Do you know what blood type your husband has? The doctor asked, insisting for some strange reason. Maybe the situation had indeed become more personal than it should have, or he was just too tired and irritated. Most likely it was all of the above. As soon as the words left his mouth, he immediately realized he would regret it later. But why are you asking? Inko replied confidently, raising her tear-stained, bewildered eyes to meet the doctor's gaze. Mitsuki felt as if the ground was slipping away beneath her feet. She knew about this detail about Izuku's blood type, about Inko's blood type, but she had never given it any significance, believing it was just a coincidence. Now everything fell into place. She pulled away, involuntarily breaking their embrace, but kept her hand on her friend's shoulder. Dr. Watanabe didn't seem nearly as shocked. He just lowered his gaze for a moment and sighed heavily. Midoriya-san, he began carefully, let me ask you one more question. What is Izuku's blood type? Inko froze as if the temperature in the room had instantly dropped by dozens of degrees. Her eyes widened with the realization of where this conversation was heading. First, she whispered, he has type A blood. Mitsuki gripped her friend's hands tighter, feeling her tremble. And what about you? The doctor asked quietly. Is third. Inko's voice trembled, but it doesn't mean anything. Hisashi, he loves Izuku. He's always been a good father, and she immediately began speaking quickly. It was a habit when she started to worry and wasn't completely sure about something. Watanabe stopped the flow of words with a gentle gesture. Midoriya-san, I'm not trying to cast doubt on your relationship, but these facts might be important for understanding the situation. He took a deep breath, preparing to drop a bombshell on their heads. Has your husband ever shown aggression towards Izuku? Inko recoiled, pushing away her friend's hand as if she had been struck. Her eyes filled with horror, and her hands instinctively clenched into fists. No, she exclaimed, her voice trembling with rage and pain. Hisashi has never raised a hand against Izuku. He's a good father, he loves our boy. Mitsuki felt as if everything inside her was turning cold. She saw how her friend was struggling with her emotions, how her face contorted with pain and anger. Inko, wait a moment. Mitsuki began gently, trying to calm her, placing her hand gently over her trembling palm again. Fortunately, this time Inko didn't pull away. The doctor is just trying to understand the situation. This isn't an accusation, it's an attempt to understand. Watanabe watched Inko's reaction carefully. He realized he had gone too far. As an emergency department doctor, he was trained and obliged to identify such cases. And although he himself doubted that child abuse was possible given his father's behavior, the pictures still didn't add up. A person can't just abandon their wife and child in the hospital like that. I'm not saying your husband is aggressive, he continued in a calm voice, but it's important to understand if there were any conflicts, tense moments between him and Izuku. Between you? Inko spoke timidly. We've been arguing a lot lately, she admitted. Mitsuki felt her heart skip a beat. She gripped her friend's hand tighter, as if trying to protect her from her own words. Inko, she said softly, tell us more. What exactly was happening? He's been drinking a lot in the evenings lately, Midoriya began, lowering her gaze. He was just tired. The work was hard. But he was taking care of us, right? She hurried to add and continued more quietly. He could make remarks about cleanliness, or that I wasn't spending enough time on raising the child, or... When she started speaking, it was as if a dam had broken. Mentioning that sometimes Hisashi slept in the living room, or stayed at work longer and longer, she immediately came up with numerous explanations for this and said that she was fine. That she and Izuku were fine. The doctor couldn't agree with the idea that Izuku was fine. Most likely, the parents had never even asked him about it, or thought that he didn't know anything. Mitsuki felt her friend slipping away from reality, immersing herself in a world of her own justifications. She gently but insistently interrupted the flow of words. Inko, what you're saying is important. But let's face the truth. You yourself see that something is wrong. Dr. Watanabe listened attentively without interrupting, but his gaze grew increasingly serious. Midoriya-san, let me ask you a direct question. Did you truly feel safe around your husband? He asked, looking her straight in the eyes. Inko froze as if the question had hit her. Her hands began to tremble, and her voice betrayingly faltered, interrupted by sobs of desperate crying. I don't know. I just don't believe that he could. that he is capable of anything bad. Mitsuki hugged her friend, feeling her trembling in her embrace. You're not alone. Masaru, we're all here to help you. And not just you. We'll do everything possible to help Izuku too, she whispered quietly, offering words of comfort and support. Dr. Watanabe sighed heavily and rubbed his forehead with his hands. Midoriya-san, I understand it's difficult, especially now. But the sooner we understand the situation, the faster we can help you and your son. You said your husband drank a lot. Were there instances when he came home drunk and aggressive? He continued to insist, to rule out any possible ifs. Inko, slightly calmed in her friend's embrace, closed her eyes, trying to gather her thoughts. He was sometimes irritable. He yelled. But he never raised a hand. Never. Desperation was evident in her voice. Mitsuki cast a glance at the doctor over the shoulder of the sobbing Inko, signaling him to stop. They had heard enough about this. And she, apparently, didn't remember what had happened before right now. The doctor clearly understood the visual message and took another deep breath. This time it didn't sound so heavy, but rather was a sign of slight, yet relief. All right, he pondered, for now, that's enough. The main thing was that they had ruled out the worst possibilities, even if not completely. They would be able to piece together the full picture of what had happened later. Probably, at some point, they would have to find Hisashi. Inko sniffed again, reaching for a new supply of tissues. Mitsuki responded by slightly pulling away and gently stopping her hand, offering, "Let me help. You'll rub your nose and eyes raw." In response, she received only a few uncertain nods from her friend. But that was enough. Carefully taking the tissues from her hands, she lightly moistened them with glycerin. This would help soften them for Inko's skin, already inflamed from tears and snot, and would also slightly refresh her skin, allowing her to feel, if only slightly, better. Mitsuki acted carefully and tenderly, gently wiping the tears from her friend's face. Her movements were calm and confident, as if she were trying to pass on to Inko some of the inner calm she herself possessed. Inko, in turn, allowed herself to be cared for, her shoulders gradually relaxing under the gentle touches. She closed her eyes, trying to find solace in simple human contact. Dr. Watanabe observed this scene, feeling relieved that the situation might not be as catastrophic as it initially seemed, and that the first conversation with the young patient's mother had gone much easier than expected. But he knew it wasn't over yet. He briefly contemplated what next steps to take before saying, returning his professional smile, "You're probably dying of impatience to see your son." Inko's eyes snapped open as if these words had brought her back to reality. Her hands involuntarily clenched into fists, crumpling the wet tissues into a ball, and hope mixed with anxiety appeared in her eyes. Yes, I want to see him," she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. "Do you think, will they let me?" Mitsuki continued to gently comfort her friend, softly patting her back in circular motions, helping her calm down. "I'm sure Dr. Watanabe will help us," she said softly with a slight smile, not taking her eyes off Inko's face. "Physically you're fine. You're also of sound mind," he paused, "as far as I can tell. Despite the serious stress," he explained, slowly getting to his feet. "We can go see him right now," he added once he regained his balance. Inko slowly turned on the couch to face the doctor and lowered her legs. Can I go to him?" she whispered, hesitant to stand up fully. "Are you ready to walk on your own, or should I ask for a wheelchair?" Watanabe asked, preparing to support the patient if necessary. Mitsuki also got up and, coming around the couch, supported her friend by the elbow. "Inko, listen. You don't need to rush. We can do everything carefully." Inko took a deep breath, gathering her strength. I can walk on my own. I just feel a bit dizzy," she assured them. In reality, even if her legs had completely stopped working, she would have insisted on going to see her son as soon as possible. She would have crawled, gripping the tiles with her teeth if necessary. She carefully shifted her weight onto both legs, and Mitsuki gently helped her friend get up from the couch. Inko swayed but quickly regained her balance. "See? I'm fine," she said a bit more confidently with a slight smile. Although she was, in many people's opinion, extremely prone to tears, she could also quickly recover at the same time. So the tears would certainly start again as soon as she saw Izuku, but right now it was much more important to see with her own eyes as soon as possible that everything was okay. Excellent, the doctor nodded. Then let's go. Just slowly and without rushing, he warned. Inko nodded, her fingers nervously gripping Mitsuki's coat sleeve. She felt weak, but determination appeared in her eyes. A determination against which any weakness would seem like mere fatigue. Can you tell me about his condition? She asked carefully, as if feeling unworthy to ask questions. Dr. Watanabe looked at Inko attentively, opening the door to the hallway. Of course, Midoriya-san. Your son's condition is currently stable and he will recover quickly, he assured her. The quirk itself regenerated the wounds created during its awakening. Mitsuki supported her friend, carefully holding her elbow. Overall, Inko was walking quite steadily on her own, not requiring assistance, but it wouldn't hurt to be cautious. Hear that? The doctors say everything will be fine, she assured her. The only thing that will bother him in the near future, the doctor continued as they entered the corridor, is the wound from biting his tongue. But that's nothing serious either. He decided to omit as many details as possible. A more detailed explanation of the child's condition could be left until discharge, when everyone would be less tired and more emotionally stable. Information about respiratory arrest, weight loss, and serious blood loss would only make things worse now. They were actually very lucky. 3 minutes without oxygen definitely wouldn't have passed without consequences. However, it seemed that the damage had either been regenerated or hadn't occurred at all due to the influence of the quirk development process. Inko swallowed slightly. Nothing serious wasn't enough for her. The mere fact that her dear, sweet Izuku had gotten hurt was terrible enough, no matter how minor. When will he come to? She asked, not wanting to dwell too much on it. He already has, Akira replied. Today he will be waking up and falling asleep again, but tomorrow he will definitely be able to stay awake as usual. Inko froze for a second. What do you mean? She asked, feeling the blood drain from her face. Dr. Watanabe also stopped and, turning around, smiled gently. Don't be afraid, Midoriya-san. Your son has already regained consciousness. True, only briefly. He was a bit disoriented, but the doctors managed to conduct a brief examination. And he did manage to speak with us. See, Inko? It's not as bad as you thought, Mitsuki added, doing her best to keep her voice from trembling at the memory of the child waking up. They continued moving slowly down the corridor. Inko walked as if in a fog, trying to process what she had heard. Her son was alive, he had regained consciousness. These thoughts swirled in her head, bringing both relief and anxiety. And how did he feel? What did he say? She asked, not hiding her concern. He was a bit disoriented. Watanabe began to answer, but paused to choose his words carefully. There are some side effects of the quirk, but that's normal. A specialist will visit you tomorrow and help explain everything. Inko was once again overcome by a wave of anxiety. Her fingers frantically clutched Mitsuki's coat sleeve. Side effects? What side effects? Her voice trembled. What do you mean? Dr. Watanabe turned around again and looked at the woman carefully. Midoriya-san, there's no need to worry prematurely. These are natural processes related to the development of his quirk. Nothing dangerous, just the body adjusting. Mitsuki tightened her grip on her friend's hand. Inko, listen. The doctor says everything is under control. It just needs a little time, she reassured. I saw him myself. He's as well as can be expected. I certainly wouldn't lie to you about something like this. In fact, how much this was a lie depended on where, as well as can be expected, was on your scale, and Mitsuki was more inclined to think that she had just lied to her friend. Anyway, they finally reached the ward. Mitsuki again restrained herself from flinching as the observation window and door came into view again. She sighed heavily. Well, here we are, she commented. Inko wasn't ready to go in yet. Not now. She needed a moment to gather her strength. An endless stream of thoughts, fear, and anxiety were tangling into a tight knot in her stomach, making it hard to breathe. And his quirk, she began, hoping that more information would help her prepare. His quirk is... She stopped again. Her face took on a strange expression, something between fear, disgust, and anxiety. She seemed to be trying to find the strength to say the word. It's wings, right? As soon as it was said, her voice trembled slightly and her eyes dropped. Mitsuki, like Watanabe, couldn't help but notice how fake and tense that sounded. Inko seemed to spit the word out of her mouth. Her friend Bakugo knew that Inko had always approached her son's quirk with trepidation, impatience, and anticipation. But something had definitely changed. Yes, Inko, she replied gently, it's wings. But it's a part of Izuku, and it makes him special. There was definitely something there. It was as clear as day to the doctor. For some reason, this particular aspect of her son's quirk was causing a strange reaction in the mother. He noticed how her eyes dimmed and her movements stopped as she spoke. It looked like another dissociation. Exactly like the one she had experienced when she first arrived here a few hours ago. This connection explained her state at that moment, but what had caused it was hard to say. Inko, is something wrong? Mitsuki asked softly, yet still too directly, leaning closer. You seem afraid of his quirk. Dr. Watanabe frowned slightly and glanced through the observation window into the ward. Midoriya-san, if you have any concerns or questions about your son's quirk, we're ready to answer them, he said after a couple of seconds, turning his gaze back to Inko. What? No, she immediately denied. Why would you even think such a thing? Her face paled even more, and her hands began nervously picking at the skin around her nails. Mitsuki watched her friend closely, feeling that she was being as sincere as ever. But something was still off. However, now wasn't the time to press her. Inko, she said softly, you can trust us. If something is bothering you, it's better to say it now. Inko swallowed, her fingers continuing to move nervously. But I'm just afraid that he'll be different. That other child, that they'll bully him because of it. Mitsuki gave an encouraging smile. You know your son is stronger than he seems. And he has friends who will support him, she assured, deciding to ignore how her friend avoided saying the word a second time. I'm sure Katsuki will kick the butt of anyone who even looks sideways at Izuku. Besides, as I said, a quirk specialist will visit you tomorrow, the doctor added. He'll help register the quirk and learn how to control it. Of course, you'll need to visit a more specialized expert in such quirks in the future, but everything will be fine. Inko nodded slowly, still hesitating to meet her interlocutor's eyes. Okay, maybe you're right. It's just, give me another minute, she said, but tears began flowing from her eyes again. Mitsuki nodded silently, understanding that her friend needed time. She didn't insist, only gently squeezed her hand in a sign of support. Dr. Watanabe, seeing that the situation was stabilizing, decided not to rush things. We'll wait as long as needed. When you're ready, we'll go to Izuku. Maybe you should rest a bit, he suggested a little later. We can visit Midoriya-kun later, when you're feeling better. Inko's reaction made him doubt whether he had done the right thing by allowing them to see him so soon. Inko slowly shook her head from side to side, wiping away the last tears. But I want to see Izuku. I want to be near him. Please, can I see him? Of course, the doctor replied with an uncertain smile. Are you ready then? He asked, gesturing softly toward the door. In any case, going back on his words now would be too much. Besides, the nurse, as well as Bakugo-san, would be nearby for at least the near future. Mitsuki hugged her friend again. She was almost unable to hold back her own tears, but feeling Inko gradually calming down in her embrace, she took a deep breath and managed to contain them. Everything will be fine, Inko. We'll get through this. Together. She had to be strong for her now. At that moment, the ward door opened slightly, and the nurse, already familiar to Mitsuki, peeked out. Sorry to interrupt, but the child will likely wake up again soon, she whispered. Inko froze, her eyes filling with hope once more. She swallowed hard, trying to cope with her excitement, glancing first at her friend, then at the doctor, as if waiting for permission to enter her son's room. Akira nodded, gesturing for them to follow the nurse. Inko went in first. Watanabe looked at Mitsuki, and they exchanged understanding glances. Despite all the difficulties and questions that still needed to be resolved, it was important now to give Inko time to recover and for Izuku to reunite with his mother, regardless of all the dangers. which were essentially quite illusory. The answers, they would come. Sooner or later, all secrets would be revealed, but now the main thing was to recover from this long night. The doctor didn't enter the room. "If you'll allow it, I'll leave you alone for a while," he said. "My shift ended 3 hours ago, and there are other patients who need to be visited." "Sorry." Mitsuki nodded understandingly. "You've done far more than you had to." "Thank you," she paused. "And don't DMN it, apologize for having to do your job." "Go ahead." She waved her hand in a dismissive gesture. Watanabe let out a short, muffled laugh and smiled. Bowing once more, he said before leaving, "I'll be back in 3, maybe 4 hours. If anything, you can always ask the nurse to call me." The woman turned away theatrically and waved her hand. "I got it," she said, closing the door and walking further into the room. At that moment, her phone vibrated, signaling a new message. Taking it out and glancing at the screen, she saw it was a message from Masaru. It seemed they had finished processing the accident and were now planning to come to the hospital and wait for her in the cafeteria. After sending a reply saying she needed more time, she stopped at the entrance and watched her friend. She saw Inko's expression change from anxious anticipation to gentle tenderness. How her fingers trembled as she cautiously approached her son. She knew that despite everything that had happened and the many questions, right now Inko was exactly where she needed to be next to her child. Inko sat down on the chair next to the cot, not taking her eyes off the sleeping Izuku. Her breathing became steady and calm, as if her child's presence gave her strength and peace. Ahead, they faced new challenges. They had to essentially rebuild their family, this time without a father. To deal with new abilities associated with a rather rare and unusual quirk. And many other things they didn't even know about yet. But this moment of reunion was a small miracle that, if only slightly, instilled faith in the best,